The America is an epic two-volume historical novel detailing the birth and maturation of a continent. Let's begin. Part 1. Gold and Salt Tears, 1607. The air tasted of decay and promise. Elias Thorne, late of Worcestershire and now resident of a sun-baked malarial swamp, pulled his linen ruff away from his sweating neck. The lace, once crisp and white, was now the color of muddy river water, clinging to his skin like a shroud. He wiped a stinging bead of sweat from his eye, his gaze fixed on the palisade wall, a pitiful cage of sharpened logs standing against an infinite green wilderness. It was May 1607, Jamestown. They had named it for the king, but the king felt a world and an ocean away. Elias was the younger son, a casualty of the English law of primogeniture. He had no estate, no title, and only the fading goodwill of his gentry family to recommend him. His ticket to this new world, a share in the Virginia Company, had been bought with the remainder of a small inheritance and a colossal, almost blinding self-belief. He was here for gold. Gold to return to London with, gold to buy land, gold to make his elder brother bow in respect. But the reality of Virginia was a slow, agonizing process of disillusionment. They had arrived with 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, 104 men and boys filled with the swagger of adventurers. 6 weeks later, a quarter of them were dead. Not from arrows, though the silent, sharp attacks from the woods were common enough, but from the land itself. The brackish river water, the stagnant air, the gnawing hunger that never truly left a man. "Tournay, stop preening and fetch that timber," barked Master John Martin, a sour-faced counselor whose every word seemed to carry the weight of his perpetual displeasure. Elias scowled, but obeyed. Martin was one of the gentlemen who had quickly proven useless at actual labor. Most of the early losses had been among the laborers and servants, those men whose calloused hands were meant to build this colony. But the gentlemen, having never been forced to work, had quickly succumbed to fever and despair when their servants died. Elias, despite his gentry status, was young and strong, and sheer necessity had driven him to pick up an axe. He hefted the heavy pine log onto his shoulder. The heat radiating off the newly cleared earth made the air shimmer. "He's got the fever," muttered Thomas, a skinny tailor from London, pointing to a man leaning weakly against the nascent church frame. Elias glanced over. The man, a mason named Henry, was trembling violently, his eyes yellowed, his skin clammy despite the heat. He hadn't been well since they picked the site, a low-lying marshy peninsula that was easy to defend but impossible to live on. "Salt-water tides washed the drinking water," Elias said, reciting the growing colonial wisdom. "And the mud gives birth to the night sweats. He won't see autumn." Thomas shivered. "Don't say it, Torn. Say a prayer instead." Elias simply shifted the log's weight. Prayers were cheap, but labor was life. They were too few to bury their dead properly anymore. The graveyard was a pitiful series of mounds right outside the fort walls, unmarked so the local tribes wouldn't know how desperate their situation was. Inside the palisade, life was chaos, a frantic, ill-planned attempt to recreate England in a hostile climate. They should have been planting corn. Instead, they were digging trenches in search of gold ore, fool's gold mostly, iron pyrite. The company's instructions, brought over by Captain Newport, had been clear. Find the South Sea, find gold, or find the lost Roanoke colonists. Farming was an afterthought. As the sun began to dip, casting long, menacing shadows from the great trees surrounding the clearing, Captain John Smith returned. He was an irritant to the gentlemen, small, rough, and insubordinate, but the only man who seemed to know how to get things done. He marched back from the riverbank, haggard but resolute, 2 water casks on his shoulder. "The gentlemen are fighting over the governance again, Captain," Elias reported dryly, wiping his brow. Smith spat. "They may fight over the empty throne of England for all I care. Which of them has found a root to eat or a feather to trade? We starve while they debate bylaws. I found no game today, only the shadow of the forest." He looked at Elias, a sharp, knowing assessment in his eyes. "You've grown lean, Thorne. Good. Fat men die first here. They complain more." "We need corn, Captain, or we need to treat with the Indians. The Paspahegh? They have had enough of our greed. We rely on the generosity of the Werowance, the great chief Powhatan, for now, but that reliance is a knife held to our throats. They feed us not from friendship, but to keep us weak and indebted." Smith's pragmatic ruthlessness was the only reason any of us still breathe. Elias knew that, and in this land of impossible challenges, Elias had begun to discard his London vanities and recognize true worth. It wasn't titles that mattered, but the ability to hunt, barter, and build. The smell of the communal stew, thin, watery, and tasting faintly of smoke and desperation, signaled the end of the day. As Elias ate his meager portion, he looked out at the great river, the Powhatan, or the James as they called it. It flowed past, vast and indifferent, the true master of this place. Part 2. The Silent Watch. Kiana knew the settlers were fools. She was 16 summers old, her skin the color of warm honey, her black hair braided with river shells. She stood on the high wooded ridge overlooking the newcomer's fort, her bow loose in her hand, the smell of pine and damp earth clinging to her deerskin tunic. She was not alone. Her uncle, Chief Opitapan, and 3 seasoned warriors stood behind her, silently observing the English folly. They had been watching since the large canoes first appeared on the great river, shining with white sails like massive, sickly white swans. Kiana's people, the Powhatan, were the undisputed rulers of the Senekamaka, the densely inhabited land. Their Mamanatawek, or paramount chief, Wahon Seneca, whom the English called Powhatan, controlled nearly 30 distinct tribes and territories. They were a sophisticated political power, not the scattered savages the English believed. "They are loud," Opechopin murmured, his voice a dry whisper that barely disturbed the forest's silence. "They talk too much. They cough all the time." Kiana nodded. The noise was the most astonishing thing about the Tasantasas, the strangers. They were always hammering, shouting, or arguing. And the stench. Even from this distance, the wind sometimes carried the heavy, sour odor of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and open privies. Their village, a flimsy cage of wood, was already fouled. "They do not plant," Kiana observed, resting her chin on her fist. "We watched them dig, but not for roots or seeds, only dirt that glitters. They starve even now." This was the core puzzle for the Powhatan. Why travel across the great water to a land teeming with life, deer, fish, cornfields, and rich soil, only to settle in a swamp, dig for useless shiny rocks, and refuse the labor of planting? Opechopin smiled, a fleeting, calculating expression. "They are like children who demand the shell of the oyster but discard the meat. They think the world owes them food. Wahoo Seneca says we should feed them enough to keep them alive, but not enough to make them strong. A hungry dog is a useful dog." He pointed down at the fort. A small group of Englishmen, including the wiry, short one they knew as Captain Smith, were outside the palisade, trying awkwardly to fish with a long net. "Look at the way they hold their tools," Opechopin continued, "like they are afraid the shovel will bite them.
They are werrow ants, chiefs, who have no hunting skill and no gardening skill. They will die, or they will leave. We wait." Kiana's gaze drifted to the young man, Elias, who was hauling timber. He was different from the others. He worked with a grim determination, unlike the lazy arrogance of the men in the velvet coats that sat in the small hut they called a church. She had seen him collapse with fever 2 weeks ago, and now he was back, pale but working. The tasantasas had already shown their deadly.
A flash of movement in the trees behind the English caught Kiana's eye. It was Namontak, one of Powhatan's younger cousins, who was often sent to spy. Namontak, though an accomplished hunter, had adopted some of the settlers' habits, having spent time inside the fort. He appeared minutes later, greeting Opichapam with a respectful bow. "They're worse than before, uncle," Namontak reported. "The fever is heavy. Their leaders fight among themselves. They tried to depose the fat captain, Ratcliffe, for the 3rd time this month. Their food stores are nearly gone, even what we traded them." "And the gold?" Opichapam asked, his eyes narrow. "They found more bright dirt. They think it is fortune. Smith says it is trash. They will not listen to him. They listen only to their own dying hopes." Kiana felt a strange blend of pity and cultural contempt. Her people understood the land. They worked with its rhythms. These Tasantasas fought the land, imposing their wills upon it rather than submitting to its laws. They sought riches that had no meaning here, a metal that could not be eaten, woven, or burned for warmth. Opichapam drew a stick across the earth, erasing the small marks he had made while listening. "Let them survive the summer," he said, concluding the meeting. "The winter will test their hearts. When they are at their weakest, we will know their true intentions. Kiana, you will keep watching. Note which ones work and which ones scheme. And, child, be cautious of their despair. A desperate man is the most dangerous kind of predator." Kiana nodded, her eyes lingering for a moment on the young Englishman who was now dragging his log toward the growing skeleton of a storehouse. She saw not a conqueror, but a man rapidly being ground down into the red dust of Senekamaka. Part 3. The Consumption, 1609 to 1610. The winter of 1609 to 1610 became known simply as the Starving Time. It was a nightmare forged of ice, hunger, and human rot. Elias Thorne no longer saw the world in shades of hope or ambition. He saw it in shades of brown and gray. Brown for the sludge they drank, and gray for the pallor of the dead. His fine linen suit had long since rotted, replaced by rough leather patches scavenged from dead men's baggage. His hands, once soft, were now split, scarred, and perpetually black with grime. Only 50 miles away, the vast, ordered empire of the Powhatan Confederacy survived the seasonal hardships with relative ease, their corn granaries full, their villages warm. But Jamestown was a tomb. The crisis had not come from a single catastrophe, but from a series of compounding errors. The foolish hunt for gold had wasted precious farming seasons. Their aggressive demands for food had finally exhausted the patience of Wahunsenekak, who ordered a complete and brutal siege. No more gifts, no more trade. The English were sealed inside their stockade, waiting to be consumed by the cold and the hunger they had brought upon themselves. Elias sat huddled near the weak fire in the common house, his knees drawn up to his chest. There were only about 60 colonists left alive out of the 500 who had been present when the last resupply ship arrived in August. That ship, however, had brought little food and many sick, useless mouths to feed, having been scattered by a hurricane. "The rats are gone," whispered a man named Giles, his voice a dry rasp. "I know," Elias replied, his throat raw. They had hunted and eaten every rat, every dog, every cat, and every horse. They had boiled leather straps and shoe soles to make a foul, gelatinous soup. They had eaten the roots of the trees and the mud daubers' nests. Giles leaned closer, his eyes wide and feverish, reflecting the weak firelight. "Did you hear about the one who dug up his wife?" Elias didn't answer. He had heard. The stories of desperation were no longer whispers. They were the currency of their survival. Horrible tales passed around the common house like prayer beads. There were accounts of men eating fellow colonists who had already died of fever, and worse if the rumors were to be believed. The line between civilization and savagery had long since blurred, then vanished entirely. He thought of Kiana. He had seen her once, briefly, during a desperate foray outside the walls weeks ago, before the snow began. He had been looking for anything, a stray bird, a berry, a sign of game, when he saw her standing by a thicket of holly, watching him. She wasn't carrying a weapon, only watching. Her face was serene and well-fed, a stark contrast to his own skeletal features. He had started toward her, ready to beg or barter, but she had simply shaken her head, a gesture of profound, ancient pity. Then she was gone, swallowed by the forest she belonged to. That moment had brought him a sickening realization. They were not here to settle. They were here to be judged. The new world did not want them. In the morning, the body of the counselor, Master Martin, was found stiffly frozen outside the church. He had died not of fever, but of cold and malnutrition. No one wept. They simply stripped him of his usable clothing and carried his body to the hole, covering it quickly before the ice could harden again. "We must go," Elias said, standing up on shaky legs. His decision was sudden, sharp, and cold as the Virginia winter. Giles started. "Go where? Smith is gone. He was injured and returned to England. Percy is in charge, and he can barely stand." Captain Smith had been their best chance, but a terrible gunpowder accident had forced him back to England months earlier, and the ensuing power vacuum had plunged the colony into anarchy and starvation. "Go home, Giles," Elias repeated. "If we can find a vessel, any vessel, we must leave this place. We came seeking a crown, and we found only a grave. We have failed." It was not a surrender. It was a tactical retreat, a recognition that the real treasure, the ability to sustain life, was held by the people they had tried to conquer. Elias spent the next 2 weeks helping to patch up the Discovery, the smallest of the 3 original ships. The process was agonizing, every hammer blow costing a calorie they could not afford to lose. But the dream of survival, however frail, was a powerful motivator. In late May 1610, the remaining 50 or so colonists were ready. They climbed aboard the leaky Discovery and a salvaged pinnace, leaving their dead comrades, their useless fort, and their golden fantasies behind. As Elias stood on the deck, watching the palisade shrink into the distance, he felt neither regret nor relief, just a vast, desolate emptiness. They drifted down the James River, a pitiful flotilla of ghosts fleeing a ghost town. They had lost. The America, so far, had won. But as the river widened and the Chesapeake Bay came into view, something unexpected appeared on the horizon, the majestic, billowing sails of a ship, then another, and another. A fleet of supply ships, commanded by the new governor, Lord Delaware, had arrived. The sight broke the colonists entirely, not with joy, but with the crushing finality of their failure. They had starved, suffered, and abandoned their purpose only to be found minutes from escape. Elias watched as the great ship approached. Lord Delaware's forces were strong, well-fed, and numerous. Their orders were clear: to stop the retreat and rebuild the colony, no matter the cost. Elias looked back at the receding river bank. The forest was watching. He knew Kiana was out there somewhere, her people waiting. The fight was not over. The fevered shore still held them, and the second, far more violent act of the American experiment was about to begin. The English, now chastened and under strict martial law, would no longer beg for food. They would take it. And the Powhatan, seeing that the Tasantasas refused to simply die, would be forced to decide whether to annihilate them completely or find a way to coexist with the pestilence that had landed upon their soil.
Part 4. The Vile Smoke, 1610 to 1614. Lord de la Warr, dressed in armor polished to a menacing sheen, was not a savior, he was a conqueror. His arrival in June 1610 had stopped the pitiful retreat of the surviving 50 colonists, Elias Thorne among them, and replaced the anarchy of Jamestown with the cold, unforgiving order of martial law. The new era began not with cheers, but with the crack of a whip and the thud of the shovel. Elias had exchanged the fear of starvation for the terror of the firing squad. The laws divine, moral, and martial, imposed by Deputy Governor Sir Thomas Dale, were simple and brutally effective. Steal food? Death. Skip church? Death. Run away to the Indians? Death by slow torture. The colony was now a penal work camp, and Elias, his body already hardened by famine, was forced into the ranks of the labor corps. "We came for gold, and they give us gallows," Elias muttered one suffocating morning, digging a drainage trench deep in the malarial soil. His foreman, a ruthless former soldier named Harwood, kicked dirt onto his shovel. "You came for easy pickings, Thorne. This is what empire looks like. Discipline. This colony will survive now, not because God wills it, but because Dale won't let us die. The alternative to this misery is far worse misery." The fever still stalked them, but the fear of Dale's law was a more immediate corrective. The men, drilled relentlessly and forced to work 6 days a week, began to clear land in earnest. Houses were built, the fort walls reinforced, and corn was finally planted, though it was still far too late to feed them all. The new policy toward the Powhatan was equally brutal. Under the logic of self-preservation, the English stopped begging for food and began simply taking it. This ushered in the fiercest phase of the First Anglo-Powhatan War. The English burned villages, destroyed cornfields, and killed anyone who resisted. One afternoon, Elias was part of a raiding party that sailed up the James River to attack a Pespaheg village. The sight of the burning longhouses, the screams, and the utter, senseless destruction, children scattering into the woods like quail, chilled him far more than the thought of cannibalism during the starving time. That was desperation. This was calculated cruelty in the name of the crown. They returned with 5 canoes full of stolen corn, and Elias felt the heavy shame of it, a shame that was quickly drowned out by the gnawing hunger that the bounty would briefly satisfy. Meanwhile,
Another kind of labor was taking root, far from the battlefields. John Rolfe, a quiet gentleman whose wife had perished in the shipwreck that brought the supply ships, was obsessed with a bitter native crop. The local Powhatan tobacco was too harsh for the sophisticated European palate. Rolfe, however, had smuggled seeds of a sweeter strain from Trinidad, and he began planting them secretly in his small garden plot. Elias first noticed it in 1612. Rolfe's patch of land, previously ignored, was now a manicured riot of broad green leaves. "What madness is this, Rolfe?" he asked, leaning on his hoe. "We need corn, not smoke." Rolfe, thin and intense, ran a hand over a sticky leaf. "This is better than corn, Thorn. It is better than gold. We can eat corn here, but England demands a commodity, something only this land can provide." He showed Elias how to cure the leaves, drying them in the heat, then carefully stripping them into dark, fragrant shreds. He spoke of the increasing addiction in Europe, how the English and Spanish were paying exorbitant prices for the vile weed. "It is not gold, Elias, but it buys gold. It buys food, clothes, steel, and stability. This, not a shiny rock, is the true treasure of Virginia," Rolfe proclaimed. Elias, still skeptical, but recognizing a fierce new ambition, agreed to help. They cleared more land, and Elias, using his engineering sense, honed by years of failure, devised a more efficient method of drying the massive leaves. The first bales, shipped back to England on a trial basis, were greeted with instant success. The demand was insatiable. By 1614, tobacco had completely transformed Jamestown. The ditches were still dug, and the martial law was still enforced, but the focus was no longer survival, it was profit. Every available inch of ground, even the graveyard outside the palisade walls, was torn up and planted with the sacred, profane leaf. The colony's purpose had shifted from military outpost to cash crop factory. Elias Torn, now supervising a small gang of indentured servants and newly arrived laborers, was one of the first successful planters. He had found his wealth, but it was born not of noble adventure, but of dirt, nicotine, and desperation. From her vantage point, Kiana watched the transition with growing dread. The English no longer starved. They were still sickly, but they were organized, and they were expanding. The constant, acrid smell of burning tobacco now drifted over the river, a vile, persistent odor that clung to the air and threatened to suffocate the scent of pine and water. She had followed the English raids, seeing the brutality of their new military governors. The destruction was systematic, designed to break her people's will and force submission. She realized that Wahunsanauka's initial strategy, to wait for them to die, had failed. The English were a disease that, once it mutated, became incurable. In 1613, a terrible blow was struck. The English kidnapped Pocahontas, Wahunsanauka's cherished daughter, using her as a hostage to force a cessation of hostilities and a return of supplies captured. Kiana, though distant from Pocahontas in the Powhatan hierarchy, felt the profound psychological impact of the capture. It was a wound in the heart of the Confederacy. Kiana was now 20. She was a respected warrior and advisor, her youthful curiosity replaced by a hard, pragmatic distrust of the Tassintassis. She saw the English as a destructive wave, and their tobacco was the engine driving it. "The smoke owns them," Opichapam observed bitterly one day, watching the plumes rise from the fort chimneys. "But the smoke keeps them in their stockades," Kiana countered. "They fight less when they are pulling weeds and curing leaves. Maybe this greed is our only defense against their spears." The truth that followed Pocahontas's capture, culminating in her marriage to John Rolfe in 1614, was a fragile, unnatural peace. It was a moment of deep cultural intersection, but one born entirely of coercion and strategy. The Tensomakum was quiet, but the silence felt like the held breath before a great hurricane. Elias, stripped of his uniform and now clad in rough colonial homespun, looked out over his burgeoning tobacco patch. It was ugly, exhausting labor, but the sight of the crated tobacco, bound for the docks, represented freedom. He was no longer Elias Torn, failed gentleman. He was Elias Torn, planter. But the very ground he stood on was stained with blood and lies. The peace was temporary. Every seedling he planted was a declaration of war against the land and the people who knew how to live with it. He wondered if Kiana was watching, and what she saw now in the man who had traded his noble ruff for a fistful of poisonous leaves.
Part 5. The Seeds of Self-Rule, 1619. The peace of Pocahontas held for 4 years, but the peace was merely a distraction. The tobacco boom was the real revolution. By 1619, Jamestown had exploded. It was no longer a single palisade. It was a scatter of plantations stretching along the James River, each one a testament to the profitability of the brown gold. The Virginia Company, having realized that profit lay in farming, not mining, had instituted fundamental changes. To attract more labor to the sprawling plantations, the company introduced the headright system. Any man who paid for his passage, or the passage of another, received 50 acres of land. This flood of new settlers, mostly poor, desperate Englishmen coming as indentured servants, transformed the demographic and the physical landscape. Elias Thorne, who had managed to acquire several hundred acres through shrewd land acquisition and successful planting, now presided over a small operation known as the Hollyfield, named after the thicket where he had first seen Kiana watching him years ago. He was 34, his face weathered and tough, his hands permanently stained with nicotine residue. He had shed his English identity and adopted the coarse, pragmatic character of the colonial planter. "Another 5 hogsheads ready for loading, Master Thorne," announced his foreman, a newly arrived indentured servant named Henry, whose pale skin was already showing signs of the Virginia sun. "Make sure the drying is even, Henry," Elias commanded, running a skeptical hand over a barrel. "The quality is everything. If the Crown taxes us unfairly, we must hold the price." The relationship with the Crown was becoming increasingly strained. The colonists were now immensely wealthy, on paper, but they were resentful of the distant governance and the taxes levied on their sole commodity. This resentment gave birth to a revolutionary idea: self-governance. In July 1619, Elias, along with 20 other land-owning men, rode to the newly expanded Jamestown settlement. They gathered in the simple wooden church, the first representative assembly in the New World, the House of Burgesses. The atmosphere was electric. This was not the chaotic, starving council of 10 years prior. These were powerful, propertied men carving out their own destiny. Elias, representing his burgeoning Hollyfield Hundred, felt a powerful, almost religious sense of destiny. "We are no longer children of the Crown," declared Governor George Yeardley, gaveling the assembly to order.
We are citizens of Virginia. We shall make laws for the betterment of our fields, our families, and our future." The first laws passed were focused on maximizing tobacco production, setting the price floor, and punishing indolence among servants. It was a government of, by, and for the planters. But two other items of business that summer forever changed the trajectory of the America they were building. The first was the need for reliable, cheap labor. The headright system only provided temporary servants. They served 7 years and then were free to claim their own land, creating perpetual labor turnover. The Burgesses debated solutions, prioritizing permanence. The second item was an entry in the official record, a simple note among the tobacco regulations. About the latter end of August came in a Dutch man of war that sold us 20 niggers. Elias Thorne was there. He witnessed the arrival of the White Lion, a privateer ship, and the bewildered, terrified Africans, Angolans stolen from a Portuguese slave ship. They were sold as servants to Governor Yeardley and a prominent merchant. Elias watched them being led ashore, their eyes wide with disbelief, their hands chained. He saw the way the planters, men who had risked everything for their own freedom, looked at these 20 souls. It was not pity they offered, but a cold calculation of labor. The Africans were stronger, healthier, and crucially, had no end to their service. They were a permanent solution to the colony's labor problem. The sight of the chained Africans stirred Elias. He had been a servant of the Virginia Company, forced into servitude by his own ambition. But this was different. This was not service. This was ownership. Yet, as a planter struggling to expand, he also saw the logic, the terrible, irresistible economic sense. "We need hands, Master Thorne, and these hands, they never leave," Tipton whispered. Elias said nothing. He simply watched the new arrivals. The colony had survived by adapting to the land. Now, it had guaranteed its future success by importing a system of bondage that would scar the nation for centuries to come. The first seeds of democracy and the first seeds of racial slavery had been planted in the same soil, in the same summer.
Part 6. The Great Assault, 1622. The peace that had been so carefully constructed around the marriage of Pocahontas and John Rolfe was purely political. The Powhatan Confederacy was still immensely powerful, and the leader who succeeded Wahunsenacawh upon his death in 1618 was his younger brother, Opshinacanock. Opshinacanock possessed none of his brother's pragmatic patience. He saw the English expansion, the vast, greedy fields of tobacco, and the relentless land grabs not as an annoyance, but as an existential threat. He watched as the English population swelled, reaching over 1,200 souls scattered across 70 miles of riverbank. Kiana, now a trusted advisor to Opshinacanock, had long argued that the peace was a farce that only allowed the Tassantassus to grow stronger. Her fears were confirmed when John Rolfe and Pocahontas, now known as Rebecca, both died within a year of each other, one in England, one back in Virginia. The linchpin of the peace was gone. Opshinacanock began meticulously planning. For years he maintained the facade of friendship. Powhatan men and women walked freely in English settlements, trading, working, and learning the routines of their enemy. They learned where the tools were kept, where the muskets were stored, and when the guards were most lax. Kiana helped gather this vital intelligence, using her familiarity with the English camps to gauge their preparedness. In March 1622, the plan was set. Elias Thorne was at his Hollyfield plantation inspecting a shipment of new English farm implements. The morning was warm and hazy, smelling of fresh tobacco leaves and river mist. A number of local Powhatan laborers were working nearby, a common sight now. Elias was talking to his foreman, Henry, when the first sound came, not a war whoop,
but a sudden, high-pitched scream from the neighboring plantation. He turned just as a Powhatan man, who moments before had been idly sharpening a tool near the smithy, dropped his wood axe, snatched a heavy planting hoe, and brought it down with shattering force on the back of Henry's head. The assault was instantaneous and coordinated. The familiar, trusted people of the Powhatan Confederacy turned on their host simultaneously from Henricus to Jamestown. They used the English's own tools, shovels, hoes, axes, and even stolen firearms to enact a synchronized, devastating massacre. Elias threw himself behind a stack of tobacco barrels as the morning exploded into pure carnage. He grabbed his hunting musket, loaded for birdshot, and fired wildly, buying himself a few precious seconds to flee toward the woods. He ran, the air thick with the screams of the dying, the horrible, wet sounds of close-quarters slaughter, and the rising smoke of burning buildings. He saw women and children being dragged from their homes, and men falling in the tobacco rows they had worked so hard to cultivate. Optionakonuk's goal was total annihilation. Elias did not stop until he reached the relative safety of the riverbank where a small boat was tied. He looked back at his plantation, his future, his claim to greatness, now an inferno. More than 50 settlers were dead in his immediate vicinity. By the end of the day, over 340 English settlers, nearly one-third of the entire colonial population, were killed in what became known as the Great Assault of 1622. Jamestown itself miraculously survived. A converted Powhatan boy named Chonko, working for Richard Pace, warned his employer in time for the central settlement to prepare a defense. The heart survived, but the body was mutilated. Elias rowed frantically downriver toward the fort, his clothing torn, his face smeared with ash and someone else's blood. He was alive, but his wealth was gone, his community shattered, and his belief in the fragile peace utterly destroyed. As he reached the fort, where panic reigned and the air was filled with the roar of cannon fire, Elias looked back at the smoke-choked horizon. He no longer felt shame or pity for the native people. He felt only a cold, consuming hatred. A single, focused purpose forged in the fire of his ruined plantation: revenge. The battle for Virginia had just begun in earnest. The English would not retreat this time. They would now commit to a policy of permanent, total war to defend the tobacco land they had claimed. The America was proving to be a land of relentless violence and unforgiving economics.
Part 7. The Royal Stamp, 1624. The river ran red with a bitter, necessary vengeance. After the Great Assault of 1622, the English settlers did not flee, they hardened. The immediate shock gave way to a policy of unrelenting retribution. There would be no more fragile truces, no more peace hostages. There was only the calculated extermination of the Powhatan people. Elias Thorne, having lost his entire investment and nearly his life, was a tireless advocate for this savagery. He led planting parties, but these expeditions were always heavily armed and often masked as brutal search and destroy missions. The English learned to fight like their enemies. They burned every cornfield, every village, and hunted down families with cold military precision. The old martial law was revived, not just for colonists, but for the war against the natives. The bloodshed, however, revealed the Virginia Company's weakness. How could a private corporation, obsessed with maximizing shareholder profit, protect an entire colonial nation? In 1624, King James I answered that question with a single devastating stroke of royal authority. He dissolved the bankrupt and scandal-ridden Virginia Company of London, revoked its charter, and claimed Virginia as a royal colony of the Crown. Elias stood on the muddy banks of the James River, watching the English banner, the Red Cross of St. George, being hoisted over the governor's rebuilt headquarters. The symbolic shift was profound.
"It is finished, then," muttered Master Tipton, the planter whose land bordered Elias's ravaged holly field. "The company is dead. We are now subjects of the king, not shareholders of a fool's dream." "We were always subjects of the king," Elias corrected him, his voice flat. "But now the crown has an investment here, in our tobacco, in our survival. It means steel and soldiers when we need them. It means stability." Elias had learned his lesson well. In the New World, the true master was power backed by authority. The royal governor, appointed directly by the king, represented that centralized power, ensuring the lucrative tobacco flow would not be interrupted by internal dissent or external attack. The colony now had the full, grim weight of the English Empire behind its quest for land. The settlers, now property owners under the protection of the crown, focused with renewed vigor on the one thing that mattered: expanding the tobacco fields. The need for labor became an obsession.
Part 8. The Great Distinction, 1640s. The endless tobacco fields devoured the land, exhausting the soil and demanding constant fresh acreage and, critically, fresh hands. The supply of European indentured servants, poor men and women willing to sign 7-year contracts in exchange for passage, could not keep pace with the demand. Furthermore, free servants, once their time was served, demanded their own head rights and began competing with the established planters. Elias Thorne, who had rebuilt and expanded Hollyfield Hundred, now wrestled with this labor crisis. He employed a rotating cast of indentured servants, Irish, Scottish, and English, but their transience was a constant headache. He started purchasing more Africans, who were still categorized vaguely as servants, but whose contracts often lacked a clear expiration date. Elias had observed the subtle but profound legal shifts taking place across the 1640s, driven by the planter-dominated House of Burgesses. These legal changes were not sudden declarations of slavery, but small incremental laws designed to cement a permanent labor force. One of the most insidious occurred in 1640, involving a black servant named John Punch. Punch, along with 2 white indentured servants, had run away. When caught, the 2 white men had their terms of service merely extended. John Punch, however, was condemned to serve his master or his assigns for the remainder of his natural life. Elias understood the significance. Racial distinction was becoming institutionalized. The true legal turning point for Elias came with the law establishing that the condition of the child followed that of the mother. This meant that if an enslaved African woman gave birth, her child would also be enslaved. The system had become self-perpetuating. Elias saw not a moral dilemma, but an economic miracle. "They breed their own replacements, Tipton," Elias remarked to his neighbor, sipping rum on his porch overlooking his expanded fields. "No more shipping costs, no more headright claims. They are chattel now, permanent, and they will never compete with us for land."
Part 9. The Last Smoke, 1646. Kiana, now a woman of quiet, hardened dignity in her mid-50s, watched the final dismantling of her world. The English settlements had pushed the Powhatan beyond the falls of the James River, and the constant warfare had reduced the Confederacy to a shadow of its former glory. In 1644, Upchunacana, frail but still burning with hatred, launched one final desperate assault, the last gasp of the Powhatan nation. It was a massive attack, but the English were too numerous, too well-armed, and their scattered settlements too resilient to fall entirely. The final, humiliating act of the war came 2 years later. Upchunacana, now nearly 100 years old and unable to walk, was captured. Kiana was not there to witness it, but the news was carried on the wind. The great chief,
the fierce heart of the Tsunakamaka, was paraded through Jamestown as a broken curiosity. He was shot by a guard, despite orders to keep him alive. The subsequent Treaty of 1646 ceded all remaining Powhatan land on the north side of the James River and confined the surviving tribes to small, defined reservations. Their independence was over. The America was officially open for English settlement, secured by relentless violence. Kiana, watching her people scatter and submit, finally understood the nature of the Tasantasa's success. It was not courage, skill, or even their weapons that won. It was their insatiable refusal to leave. They would starve, kill, lie, and ultimately enslave one another and the world around them for the sake of two things: the desire for land and the addiction to profit. She retreated with her small family to the remote reservation lands, carrying the knowledge of the old ways like a secret dying language. The land itself still knew her name, but the sound of the English axe and the smell of the vile tobacco smoke now dominated the air. Part 10. The Divided Fields, 1660s, 1670s. By the 1660s, Elias Thorne was one of the wealthiest men in the colony. Hollyfield was a major plantation. His name was carved into the benches of the House of Burgesses, and his children were being raised in the comfort of true aristocracy. He was a member of the elite tidewater planters, those who controlled the best riverfront land and the legal machinery of the colony. But beneath this veneer of stability, a massive social fault line was forming. The planter elite, who relied almost entirely on the permanent silent labor of enslaved Africans, stood in contrast to a growing population of angry, poor, landless white men. These men, former indentured servants or recent arrivals, were forced to settle the less desirable frontier lands to the west, where they faced constant skirmishes with displaced Native American tribes, and lacked the protection and representation of the powerful tidewater elite. The laws passed by the Burgesses favored Elias and his peers. Taxes were low on land and high on exports, punishing the small farmer. The new governor, William Berkeley, ruled with a heavy hand, granting profitable fur trade monopolies to his friends and refusing to raise troops to protect the western frontier. Elias saw the resentment brewing. He saw it in the eyes of his white neighbors, who struggled to make a living on small, worn-out plots. The labor system had created a strange inversion. Poor white farmers were often forced to compete with wealthy planters who used unpaid black labor. The planter class used new laws to reinforce race, the institution of slavery, as the primary distinction, hoping to prevent the poor white and poor black populations from ever uniting against the wealthy. But in the taverns and on the dusty western roads, the landless men whispered about the corruption of the elite. They wanted cheap land, an end to the taxes, and action against the Indians. They didn't see Elias Thorne as a fellow Englishman. They saw him as a tyrant hoarding power. The tensions, stoked by class envy, racial resentment, and the constant threat of frontier conflict, were about to explode. All that was needed was a leader, a man reckless enough to challenge the king's governor and the powerful planter class. The America was about to consume its own children in a fire known as Bacon's Rebellion.
Part 11. The Torch of Rebellion, 1676. The tension on the frontier was a low, constant heat that threatened to ignite the whole colony. Elias Thorne, firmly entrenched in the wealthy tidewater planter class, felt the heat even miles away at his Hollyfield plantation. He often dismissed the angry men on the western edge, the former servants, the indebted small farmers, as insolent rabble. But they were more than rabble. They were desperate.
They were being attacked by tribes pushed westward by Elias's own class. And Governor William Berkeley, Elias's close friend and political ally, refused to commit resources to their defense. Berkeley's refusal was strategic. He protected his lucrative fur trade monopolies with the tribes and preferred to keep the poor white population contained and powerless. In the midst of this ferment, a spark landed. Nathaniel Bacon, a wealthy, educated, and ambitious young gentleman who had only recently arrived from England, settled on the frontier. He was instantly charismatic, utterly reckless, and hungry for power. Though a gentleman, he immediately took up the cause of the poor men, channeling their land hunger and anti-Indian hatred into a single, terrifying movement. Are we to stand here and watch the savages take our fields while the governor and his cronies count their furs? Bacon thundered to a crowd of 200 furious men at a tavern near the falls of the James River. The enemy is not only in the forest, but in Jamestown itself. They profit from our blood. Bacon's message was a masterwork of division. He united the poor white majority against two separate weaker enemies, the Native Americans and the aristocratic Tidewater elite. When a fresh series of raids left several Western settlers dead in the spring of 1676, Bacon demanded a commission from Governor Berkeley to lead an expedition. Berkeley, seeing the wildfire of disobedience, flatly refused, declaring Bacon and his followers rebels. Bacon ignored him. He gathered his force, a volatile mix of poor landless white men, runaway indentured servants, and even a number of enslaved Africans who were promised freedom and land if they fought, and marched west under his own authority. Elias Thorne saw the horrifying potential in this motley crew, the unity of the unpropertied. Part 12. The Fall of the Old Order. Elias sat in the House of Burgesses when the news arrived. Bacon had not only slaughtered an innocent, friendly Occaneechi tribe, but he was now marching on Jamestown, demanding to be recognized as general. Governor Berkeley, now nearly 70, was a man of honor, but also of blinding arrogance. He initially faced Bacon, declaring him a rebel, but the sheer populist fury backing Bacon caused Berkeley to back down. The Burgesses, terrified of the mob, briefly commissioned Bacon, only for Berkeley to revoke the commission the moment Bacon left the capital. The colony plunged into civil war. Elias Thorne quickly raised a loyalist militia from his plantation neighbors, determined to defend the established order and his vast land claims. He was no soldier, but he was wealthy, and wealth bought cannon and loyalty. "This is not a war against the Indians, Master Thorne," Tipton declared grimly as they organized their defense. "This is a war of the pauper against the patrician. Bacon has given the poor a voice, and it is screaming for our heads and our land." The war was disorganized and brutal. Elias's loyalist forces pursued Bacon through the countryside in a chaotic series of skirmishes, but Bacon's support among the common man was too strong. In September 1676, Bacon and his rebels marched back to Jamestown. Governor Berkeley and the Loyalists fled across the river to the eastern shore. Elias was among those who watched, horrified, as the rebels poured into the colonial capital. The rebels, fueled by rum, anger, and a potent sense of social justice, decided to leave the governor with nothing to return to. They looted the capital, then set it alight. Elias, standing on the opposite bank, watched the red glow paint the night sky. The church where the first House of Burgesses had met, the governor's manor, the storehouses, the physical symbols of English stability in the New World, were consumed by fire. He realized in that moment that all his hard-won gains, the wealth, built on tobacco and the subjugation of both native and African populations, meant nothing if the foundations of his society were so easily undermined by class warfare. The greatest threat to the planter aristocracy was not the Palatine or the king. It was the poor Englishman. Part 13. The New Chains. The rebellion crumbled as quickly as it had erupted. Nathaniel Bacon, the man who had briefly held the power of the people, fell not to a musket ball, but to the harsh reality of the New World, dysentery. He died suddenly in October 1676. Without his charismatic leader, the movement fractured. Governor Berkeley returned, filled with savage retribution. He executed over 25 of the rebel leaders, refusing to show clemency until the king's own commissioners arrived and forced him to stop. Elias Thorne, who had managed to hold his property intact through the chaos, was instrumental in rebuilding the burgesses and restoring order. He emerged from the crisis shaken, but infinitely wiser in the darker arts of political survival. The true, lasting legacy of Bacon's rebellion was a profound, chilling pact made by the elite Tidewater planters. They had seen the nightmare, the specter of poor white men and enslaved black men uniting under a common banner of poverty and resentment. The solution was not to eliminate slavery. The foundation of their wealth was too deep, but to destroy the possibility of interracial solidarity. Elias and his fellow legislators began systematically rewriting the laws of Virginia. First, they dramatically cut back on indentured servitude, ensuring fewer poor white men would arrive to compete for land and create an unstable class. Second, they hardened the racial lines of slavery into immutable law. They passed new slave codes that stripped black individuals of all rights: the right to own property, the right to testify in court against a white person, the right to travel freely, and the right to congregate. And third, and most cunningly, they created a new social contract with the poor white population. By granting white-skin status and certain legal privileges, however small, over the enslaved population, the elite created a permanent wedge. The poorest, most landless white man, though still exploited by the Elias Thornes of the world, was now given a psychological and legal elevation above all black people. He was no longer a servant in the same category. He was, by law, free. The America in the wake of this civil fire redefined itself. Its economy would be built on tobacco, and its society would be structured on a rigid racial hierarchy. The rebellion had started as a class war, but the planter elite ensured it would end with the permanent, statutory establishment of racial slavery. Elias looked out across his fields, no longer seeing a mix of temporary servants and permanent bondsmen, but seeing the future of the Republic, an aristocracy built on permanent black labor and secured by the uneasy loyalty of a privileged white majority. The age of the reckless adventurer was over. The age of the Southern planter king had begun.
Part 14. The Covenant, 1630. If Virginia was founded on gold and desperation, Massachusetts Bay was founded on a book. Thomas Alden, a former printer's apprentice and fervent Puritan 20-year-old, felt the difference immediately. He stood on the deck of the Orbella as it pitched violently in the North Atlantic chop, clutching his well-worn copy of the Geneva Bible. Around him were families, not mercenaries, skilled laborers, not impoverished gentlemen. They were not seeking a fortune, they were seeking a sanctuary, a divine contract. The leader of their fleet and their future colony, Governor John Winthrop, gathered the passengers on the pitching deck for a final sermon before they sighted land.
His voice, steady against the wind, solidified their purpose. "We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill," Winthrop declared, his eyes blazing with conviction. "The eyes of all people are upon us. If we deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world." Thomas felt the weight of the charge settle upon his shoulders like a heavy woolen cloak. This was not about growing tobacco or finding gold. This was a covenant. They were tasked by God to build a perfect, purified society, a beacon of righteousness that would redeem England itself and offer a model to all mankind. Failure was not bankruptcy. Failure was damnation. When they finally landed at Salem, and soon after established Boston, the contrast with the rough, sprawling chaos of Virginia was immediate. The Puritans built their town centered around the meeting house, which served both as the church and the town government, not individual, isolated plantations. Land was granted not based on wealth or status, but on a man's usefulness to the community and his standing in the church. This was a society built for God, not profit. Part 15. The Tyranny of Purity. Thomas quickly found his place in Boston. He apprenticed himself to a master carpenter and spent his evenings studying scripture and listening to the powerful sermons of John Cotton. Every aspect of life, from the laws passed by the magistrates to the layout of the town, was governed by the clergy's interpretation of God's will. This was a theocracy, a government ruled by religious authority. In this atmosphere of enforced piety, Thomas met Abigail Price, a thoughtful, quiet young woman whose father was a stern magistrate. Their courtship, conducted under the watchful eyes of the entire community, was constrained by layers of religious scrutiny. One afternoon, in the summer of 1636, Thomas watched as a woman named Mistress Dyer was publicly scolded and banished from the town limits. Her crime? She had worn a dress considered too elaborate and spoken out against the minister's sermon in favor of her own unauthorized interpretation of grace. The fear of antinomianism, the belief that God's grace alone, not obedience to the laws of the church, was necessary for salvation, was a constant terror for the magistrates. It threatened the very structure of their moral authority. "Look at her," Magistrate Price muttered to Thomas, his hand gripping the musket he carried. "A soul lost to pride and disobedience. In Virginia, they banish only criminals and thieves. Here, we banish those who endanger the truth." Thomas nodded, but a sliver of doubt pricked his conscience. The iron discipline that held the community together also seemed to crush the individual spirit. He recalled Winthrop's words, "The city must be pure." But how much individuality had to be sacrificed for that purity?
Part 16. The Heretic's Path. The cracks in the city upon a hill began to widen, not from the outside, but from within the ranks of the faithful. The most eloquent and dangerous dissenter was Roger Williams, a young minister who preached in Salem. Williams fundamentally challenged the entire legal and religious premise of the colony. He argued two radical points that terrified the magistrates. Religious toleration. The civil government had no authority whatsoever over the spiritual lives of its citizens. Compelling people to worship violated the true spirit of Christianity. He demanded a separation of church and state. Land rights. Williams declared that the Royal Charter, the very document establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was invalid because the land belonged to the Native Americans and the king had no right to give it away. Thomas found himself drawn to Williams's powerful, dangerous arguments.
He felt that Williams's demand for a wall of separation between the church and the government offered the only path to true, uncoerced faith. Magistrate Price, meanwhile, saw Williams as the devil's instrument. "He contaminates the spring of our purity," Price railed at Thomas. "He would have Catholics, Jews, and blasphemers living amongst us. He would dismantle the entire framework of our godly society." In the harsh winter of 1637, the General Court, led by Winthrop, ordered Williams arrested and deported back to England. But Williams escaped, fleeing into the bitter wilderness, sustained only by the kindness of the Narragansett tribe, who were his friends because he had always treated them with respect. The colony breathed a sigh of relief, believing the threat of descent was removed. But Williams, having purchased land from the Narragansett, went on to found the settlement of Providence, Rhode Island, the first permanent community in America to establish complete religious freedom and a true separation of church and state. Thomas Alden watched the rigid, exclusive walls of Boston remain standing, but he knew that a beacon of freedom had just been lit just a few days' march to the south. The contrast between the rigid, perfect city on a hill and the chaotic, tolerant haven of Providence would become a permanent feature of the American landscape, the ideal of the collective versus the necessity of individual liberty. Part 17. The Judgment of Fire, 1637. The quest for purity soon merged with the hunger for land. The fertile Connecticut River Valley lay tantalizingly empty in the eyes of the Massachusetts Bay magistrates, but it was the ancestral home of the Pequot, a powerful and well-organized tribe whose territory spanned the coast from the Narragansett Bay westward. Conflict had been simmering for years, driven by Puritan expansion and trading disputes. When a respected Puritan trader, John Oldham, was murdered by members of a tribe allied to the Pequot in 1636, the magistrates in Boston saw not an isolated crime, but a divine warrant for total war. Magistrate Price, his musket now fully loaded, declared the Pequot vessels of God's wrath, meant to be shattered to clear the path for the righteous. Thomas Alden, having married Abigail and become a respected member of the community, was required to join the militia. He felt no hatred for the Pequot, only a profound dread. He was a carpenter, a man of letters, not a killer. Yet to refuse the militia was to refuse the covenant, to risk the fate of Mistress Dyer or Roger Williams. In May 1637, Thomas marched south with a column of roughly 90 Englishmen, led by Captain John Mason of Connecticut, and accompanied by hundreds of warriors from the rival Narragansett and Mohegan tribes, allies the English had secured with Roger Williams's help. A bitter irony not lost on Thomas. The English strategy was simple and brutal: eliminate the entire tribe. Their target was a massive fortified Pequot village near the Mystic River. In the pre-dawn mist of May 26th, the Allied forces surrounded the village. The Mohegan and Narragansett warriors, expecting a standard battle where men would fight and captives would be taken, watched in stunned silence as Captain Mason gave his orders to the Puritan soldiers. "We must burn them," Mason declared, justifying the annihilation as God's will. Thomas, shivering more from fear than from the cold, was thrust into the fray. He saw Captain Mason and his men shove torches through the gaps in the palisade walls, igniting the dry wicker homes. The village erupted in fire. The ensuing scene was not a battle, but an execution. As the Pequot, mostly women, children, and the elderly, fled the flames, they were shot down by the English and their allies. Thomas fired his musket only at shadows and trees, paralyzed by the inferno and the screams. The fire purified the sight in the horrifying Old Testament sense of the word. Within an hour, nearly 500 Pequot lay dead. The English lost only 2 men. The Narragansett and Mohegan, though enemies of the Pequot, were horrified by the massacre, calling the English method of warfare too furious and a shocking display of total destruction. Back in Boston, however, the news was received with ecstatic celebration. Governor Winthrop proclaimed a day of thanksgiving. The clergy praised the victory as a miracle, proof that God had smiled upon their mission and used the English as his instrument. "It is done, Thomas," Magistrate Price said to his son-in-law, his face alight with pious certainty. "The wilderness has been cleansed. The Lord has made room for his people." Thomas looked at his hands, smelling the faint ghost of smoke and something far worse. They had secured the Connecticut Valley, eliminating the largest military threat to New England's expansion. But in the act of building their city upon a hill, they had committed an atrocity that settled like ash upon the soul of the covenant. He wondered if the light of their beacon was now irrevocably stained crimson.
Part 18. The Trading Post of the World, 1650s. Midway between the tobacco plantations of Virginia and the pious townships of Massachusetts lay a third, completely different America, built not on God or gold, but on commerce. Willem van der Zee, a robust Dutch fur and timber merchant, saw the future in the mud and bustle of New Amsterdam. Situated at the mouth of the Hudson River, the town was a ragged, chaotic port of call for the entire North Atlantic. Its defining feature was noise, the clash of 20 languages, the clanging of shipyards, and the constant cheerful haggling over beaver pelts and wampum. In New Amsterdam, your soul was your own business, but your coin was everyone's. Willem's warehouse smelled of brine, molasses, and raw mink. He traded with everyone: French Huguenots, German Lutherans, English adventurers, enslaved Africans. The Dutch West India Company had brought them since the 1620s, and the Lenape tribes who brought their furs to the edge of the palisade wall. He lived in a gabled red brick house near the quay, shared with a Catholic bookkeeper from Antwerp and a Jewish spice trader from Brazil, a mix that would have seen them all banished or jailed in Boston. The colony of New Netherland was less a nation than a sprawling, aggressive business venture. Its government, dominated by the strict but ultimately ineffective Director General Peter Stuyvesant, cared only for order and profit. Stuyvesant famously tried to ban a community of Quakers and Jews, citing their heretical beliefs, but was quickly overridden by the Dutch West India Company, whose shareholders cared only about revenue. The message was clear. In New Amsterdam, money trumped faith. Willem loved the cacophony. Here, a man was defined by his ledger, not his baptismal certificate. He believed that the mingling of people, their competing ideas, their unique crafts, their constant friction was the true engine of progress. It was a chaotic, often drunken, and always greedy model of society, but it was fundamentally free of the deadly moralistic pressure that Thomas Alden felt in Boston. Part 19. The Bloodless Conquest, 1664. The peace of commerce proved fragile when faced with English ambition. By the 1660s, the English crown viewed the Dutch wedge between their northern and southern colonies as an intolerable strategic liability. In August 1664, a small English fleet sailed quietly into the harbor. They dropped anchor and issued a simple demand: surrender. Peter Stuyvesant, a man with a wooden leg and a furious temper, prepared to resist. He stomped about the fort, ordering his meager company of soldiers to prepare their cannon. "We shall fight for the honor of the Netherlands," Stuyvesant raged to the few town elders he could gather. But the citizens of New Amsterdam did not stir. They liked Dutch goods, but they did not care for Dutch rule, which was often arrogant and heavy-handed. More importantly, they were traders, not soldiers, and war was bad for business. Willem van der Zee, along with other prominent merchants, was among those who urged Stuyvesant to stand down. "General," Willem pleaded, "the English promised to respect our property, our language, and our religion. We lose nothing but an inefficient governor. Let the trade continue." Stuyvesant, defeated not by English cannon, but by the apathy of his own people, reluctantly signed the Articles of Capitulation. The whole of New Netherland, from the island of Manhattan to the trading posts up the Hudson, passed bloodlessly into English hands. The English renamed the colony New York in honor of the king's brother, James, the Duke of York. The transition was so smooth that most ordinary citizens barely noticed. The polyglot, profit-driven nature of the place remained, merely under a new flag. The foundation was set for a massive city that would serve as the financial and cultural melting pot of the continent, proving that in America, the pursuit of wealth was often more powerful than the pursuit of godliness or political loyalty.
Part 20. Penn's Holy Experiment, 1681. West of New York, a third, equally unique vision of America took root, one founded on pacifism and radical equality. William Penn, a wealthy English gentleman and a devout convert to the Society of Friends, or Quakers, received a massive land grant from King Charles II in 1681 as repayment for a debt owed to Penn's father. Penn saw this land as a chance to fulfill a vision of Christian living that was impossible in Europe, a refuge for the persecuted, governed by love and peace. He named the territory Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods. Penn's colony was a deliberate, total refutation of the violence and religious exclusion practiced in both Virginia and Massachusetts. Its founding principles were revolutionary. Religious toleration, absolute freedom of worship for all monotheists. Pacifism. The colony would have no military, and disputes would be settled by arbitration. Fair dealing with the natives. Penn insisted on purchasing land from the local Lenlape tribe, not simply seizing it. This was Penn's holy experiment, and it attracted a massive, diverse wave of immigrants. Quakers from England, persecuted Protestants from Germany, like the Amish and Mennonites, Scots-Irish settlers, and Welsh immigrants. The promise of cheap land and no mandatory military service was irresistible. His city, Philadelphia, meaning City of Brotherly Love, was laid out with radical foresight, a grid system of wide tree-lined streets designed not for defense or piety, but for order, health, and equitable access to the riverfront for trade. The influx of non-English settlers created a culture of pluralism unmatched elsewhere. While Virginia was dominated by the English gentry and Massachusetts by the Puritan elect, Pennsylvania was a true cross-section of Europe, united only by the commitment to the inner light and the practical need for peaceful coexistence. By 1700, Philadelphia was already becoming one of the most important and rapidly growing cities in all the colonies, proving that tolerance and diversity could be the most profitable and powerful force in the New World. The stage was now set with three distinct American archetypes: the Southern planter, profit via slavery; the Northern Puritan, purity via dogma; and the Middle Colony pluralist, prosperity via diversity. Part 21. The War of Annihilation, 1675 to 1678. 40 years had passed since the Pequot War. Thomas Alden was now a grandfather, his beard white, his hands still sturdy from his carpentry trade. He had buried his rigid father-in-law, Magistrate Price, and lived long enough to see Boston grow into a small city of spires and docks.
Yet the prosperity of the city upon a hill was built on an unstable foundation of relentlessly expanding borders. The quiet diplomatic peace maintained by Massasoit, the sachem who had greeted the pilgrims at Plymouth, crumbled under the rule of his son, Metacom, known to the English as King Philip. Metacom watched as the English population doubled every 20 years, pushing Puritan settlements deeper into the Wampanoag's remaining hunting grounds and demanding jurisdiction over native people under English law. The breaking point came in 1675 with the murder of John Sassaman, a praying Indian convert, who had warned the English of Metacom's mobilization. The General Court's immediate execution of 3 Wampanoag men for the crime was seen by Metacom as an unbearable assertion of foreign rule. He decided that coexistence was impossible. The English must be driven into the sea, or the Wampanoag would perish. The war that followed was not a punitive raid like the Pequot War. It was a devastating conflagration. Metacom successfully united dozens of tribes, the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and others, in a coordinated assault that struck 52 of the 90 New England towns. For Thomas, the war was a daily terror that shattered the illusion of divine protection. He was too old to fight, but his son, Nathaniel, was quickly conscripted. The war bypassed the coastal stronghold of Boston, but raged on the western frontier. Towns like Lancaster and Deerfield were burned to the ground. Colonial families were massacred, and the flow of trade and food collapsed. The Puritan leaders, interpreting the attacks as God's punishment for their own moral failings, pride, elaborate dress, neglecting church, responded with a vengeful fury that matched Metacom's desperation. They struck with relentless brutality, refusing quarter, driven by the belief that the war was a righteous struggle between civilization and savagery. The climax of this brutality, for Thomas, was the Great Swamp Fight of December 1675. The colonial militia, convinced that the Narragansett were harboring Metacom's fighters, marched through a blizzard to attack the Narragansett's fortified winter village in the Great Swamp of Rhode Island. It was the dead of winter, and the village held hundreds of women, children, and the elderly. The militia set the entire village ablaze, replicating the horror Thomas had witnessed 40 years earlier at Mystic, but on a far grander scale. By the end of the 3-year war, New England lay ruined. 1,200 colonial homes were destroyed, and 1/10 of all fighting-age colonists, over 2,000 men, had been killed or captured. But the cost to the native people was catastrophic. Thousands were dead, and the survivors were sold into slavery in the Caribbean or forced into small dependent villages. In August 1676, Metacom was hunted down and killed. His head was brought back to Plymouth and mounted on a pole where it remained for 2 decades. The vast native power structure in New England was finally, irrevocably broken. The Puritan mission had succeeded, but at the cost of its soul. The people were safe, but the city upon a hill was indebted, bloodied, and profoundly traumatized. The war had proven that even a covenant could be soaked in fire.
Part 22. The Devil's Footprint, 1692. 16 years after the war, the air in New England was still thick with the ashes of destruction and the spiritual debt incurred. King Philip's war had broken the native power, but it had also shattered the Puritan psyche. They had survived, but at a cost that seemed too high for a people chosen by God. Surely this terrible judgment was a sign that the covenant had been broken, not by the native enemy, but by the devil within their own walls. For Thomas Alden, now a frail octogenarian whose son had survived the war, the whispers that began to drift in from Salem Village in 1692 sounded all too familiar. Hysteria began with a few young women
claiming to be tormented by invisible spirits, accusing marginalized figures, a slave woman named Tituba, a poor beggar, an old, quarrelsome woman. Soon, however, the finger pointed at respected church members. The magistrates and ministers, panicked by the collapse of their social order and desperate to cleanse their society before the second coming of Christ, quickly legitimized the accusations. They relied on spectral evidence, dreams and visions reported by the afflicted as proof of guilt. Thomas watched the same iron-willed, righteous certainty that had sent soldiers to burn native women and children at Mystic and the Great Swamp now turn inward. He saw the revered minister Cotton Mather, a man who had preached fire and brimstone throughout the recent war, advocate strongly for the trials, proclaiming that the devil was making his final stand against the godly colony. As the body count rose, 20 people executed, many more dying in prison, Thomas felt a cold, final dread replace his conscience. The city upon a hill was not a beacon, it was a cage. The pursuit of absolute purity had demanded the sacrifice of dissenters, Williams, then the external enemy, Metacom, and now its own members. When the hysteria finally began to recede, spurred by the accusation of the governor's own wife and a growing realization of the absurdity of spectral law, the magistrates stopped the trials. But the damage was done. The trials did not prove the strength of the covenant, they proved the failure of the theocracy. The Salem witch trials marked the moment the Puritan experiment in government, rooted in religious control, finally exhausted itself. Thomas Alden lived long enough to see Boston become less a sanctuary and more a bustling, secular port city, where his grandson, Elijah Alden, made his living trading New England timber and cod for West Indian molasses and rum. The anxieties of the covenant, damnation, and purity had been replaced by the anxieties of the ledger, tariffs, piracy, and the global price of sugar. Part 23. The Grand Imperial Contest, 1700 to 1740s. The first 2 decades of the 18th century belonged to the merchants, not the ministers. Thomas Alden's city upon a hill had been replaced by a bustling secular port city, where his grandson, Elijah Alden, made his living trading New England timber and cod for West Indian molasses and rum. The anxieties of the covenant, damnation, and purity had been replaced by the anxieties of the ledger, tariffs, piracy, and the global price of sugar. But the world was expanding, and every colonial transaction was now subject to the far grander, far more dangerous rivalry between the 2 great powers of Europe, Great Britain and France. France, headquartered in Quebec, controlled a massive strategic crescent of North American territory stretching from the Great Lakes down the Mississippi River to the Louisiana coast. This French Empire, New France, was primarily built on the profitable fur trade and maintained by a network of military forts and alliances with powerful native groups like the Algonquin. This French presence, the Iron Crescent, effectively contained the English colonies to the narrow strip east of the Appalachian Mountains. To the English, this was an existential threat. The French not only blockaded westward expansion, but continually incited native raids on the exposed New England frontier, known collectively as the French and Indian Wars. Elijah Alden understood the threat personally. His shipping lines were vulnerable to French privateers in the North Atlantic, and the lumber he needed came from forests constantly threatened by raiding parties. The struggle was not over theology
or tribal land, but over the vast, empty heart of the continent, specifically the fertile, unsettled Ohio River Valley. Whoever controlled the forks of the Ohio controlled the continent. The focus of colonial life shifted from the meeting house to the barracks and the colonial assembly. For the first time, the various English colonies, long focused only on their local affairs, were forced to contribute money, men, and materials to a common imperial defense. They were called on not as Puritans or Virginians, but as soldiers of the British Empire, fighting wars named after European monarchs: King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War. Elijah saw that these wars, fought hundreds of miles away in the deep interior, were turning the colonists' eyes away from Boston and toward the geopolitical map. It was a brutal education in empire. The British Crown offered military protection, but in return, it demanded greater obedience, higher taxes, and stricter adherence to mercantilism, a system designed to ensure all colonial trade enriched the mother country first. The 18th century dawned with the constant threat of French power, forcing the American colonies to recognize they were not isolated experiments in liberty or piety, but vital, profitable components of a vast and contested global empire.
Part 24. The Training Ground for Revolution, 1754 to 1763. Elijah Alden's son, Samuel Alden, did not wait for the war to come to Boston. He went to the war. By 1755, the sporadic border skirmishes of the preceding decades had exploded into a single, massive conflict over the Ohio River Valley. This was a grand, final contest for North American supremacy, what the colonists called the French and Indian War, and the world knew as the 7 Years' War. Samuel, 20 years old and eager for adventure, joined the Massachusetts militia. He traded the smell of salt water and molasses for the smells of gunpowder, pine smoke, and fear. He soon found himself deep in the forests of New York and Pennsylvania, fighting a brutal style of warfare alongside two very different kinds of allies. First were the Iroquois and other native allies, who showed him how to fight with speed and stealth, skills utterly foreign to European armies. Second were the British regulars, professional soldiers shipped from across the ocean. The regulars, stiff-backed and impeccably uniformed, treated the colonial militias with contempt. Samuel and his fellow Americans were often derisively called provincials or country bumpkins. They saw their militia leaders, like the young Virginian Colonel George Washington, scorned by haughty British officers who refused to adapt their European tactics to the dense, unforgiving American wilderness. The war lasted 9 years. It was a shared crucible of sacrifice that forged a new identity. Colonists learned that they could fight, survive, and win without constant British supervision. They felt the pride of shared victory, but also the sting of being treated as second-class subjects. The tide finally turned under the unified command of William Pitt, and the victory was total. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, formally ended French power in North America. The vast territory between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, the land Samuel and thousands of other provincials had bled for, now belonged to Great Britain. The threat was gone. But the victory carried a price that would fracture the empire. Massive debt. The war had nearly bankrupted Britain, forcing the Crown to look across the Atlantic for revenue. Who should pay for the defense of the colonies? The colonists, London decided. The Proclamation Line. To keep peace with their native allies and prevent further costly conflicts, the Crown issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding all colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. To Samuel Alden, who had fought for that territory, the line felt like a betrayal. The land they won was now forbidden. The Standing Army.
Britain left 10,000 professional soldiers in the colonies, ostensibly to enforce the proclamation line and protect the frontier. To the colonists, these soldiers were not protection. They were an unwelcome standing army enforcing obedience in peacetime. Samuel returned from the wilderness a veteran, a subject of a vastly larger and more powerful British Empire, yet feeling utterly distinct from it. The war had provided the military experience necessary for independence, and the debt and the policies that followed provided the political grievance. The victory over the French meant the colonists no longer needed British protection, but British policy now demanded their submission. The stage was set for revolution. Part 25. The Price of Empire, 1765. 2 years after the Treaty of Paris, the gratitude Samuel Alden felt for his king had curdled into resentment. He had fought Frenchmen and natives to secure the continent, only to be told he couldn't settle the land he'd won, and was now being watched by the same red-coated regulars who'd scorned him in the field. In March 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, a law that stunned the colonists because it was a direct internal tax designed purely to raise revenue, not to regulate trade. It required that all printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, diplomas, contracts, playing cards, even almanacs, carry a special, costly embossed stamp proving the tax had been paid. For Samuel, now running his father's carpentry business, the Stamp Act meant that every transaction, every bill of lading, every legal document he signed would be more expensive. It struck at the core of Boston's identity: commerce, law, and communication. If Parliament could levy this tax, what stopped them from taxing their land, their rum, or their very right to exist?
The political rhetoric that had been simmering for decades suddenly exploded into a unified, defiant message: no taxation without representation. Colonial leaders argued that while Parliament had the right to regulate trade and external tax, it had no right to levy internal taxes for revenue without the consent of the people, expressed through their own elected colonial assemblies. They had no seats in Parliament and thus could not be taxed by it. The resistance began quietly with the Stamp Act Congress in New York, where delegates from 9 colonies met to draft a joint declaration of rights and grievances. The resistance in Boston, however, was anything but quiet. It was led by the Sons of Liberty, a clandestine group of artisans, lawyers, and merchants organized by figures like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere. Samuel Alden, fueled by his wartime resentment, found himself drawn into their ranks. In August, a Boston mob, inflamed by the Sons of Liberty, stormed the office of Andrew Oliver, the appointed stamp distributor, hanging him in effigy from an elm tree, soon dubbed the Liberty Tree, and utterly demolishing his home. When Governor Thomas Hutchinson dared to defend the act, his elegant mansion was next, his furniture smashed and his valuable papers thrown into the streets. The Stamp Act was unenforceable. Every single appointed tax distributor in the colonies resigned under the threat of tar and feathers. American merchants organized a crippling boycott of British goods. The economic pressure worked. British trade collapsed, and manufacturers in London, fearing ruin, lobbied Parliament for repeal. In 1766, Parliament bowed to the inevitable and repealed the Stamp Act. Samuel Alden stood in the public square cheering the news, feeling a strength he hadn't known since he commanded his own militia unit in the woods. The colonists had faced down the empire, and they had won through collective, unified action. But Parliament was not defeated. They passed the Declaratory Act the same day they repealed the Stamp Act, asserting their full power to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The fundamental question remained unanswered: who held the ultimate power, Parliament or the people's local assemblies? And the lesson of the Stamp Act was learned not only by the Americans, that they could resist, but by the British, that they must find a less obvious way to tax. The war was over, but the fight had just begun.
Part 27. The King's Customs, 1767 to 1768. London had learned its lesson. An obvious internal tax on colonial paper was easy to mobilize against. The solution proposed by Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend in 1767 was more insidious. The Townshend Acts imposed new external duties on imported goods, glass, lead, paper, and most importantly, tea. These were custom duties, which the colonies had traditionally accepted as part of regulating trade. But now, the revenue wasn't going to regulate trade, it was going to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges. This directly undermined the colonial assemblies, who previously held power by controlling the local payroll. Samuel Alden and the Sons of Liberty were not fooled. The Crown is not demanding tribute, Samuel argued at a meeting in the smoky back room of the Green Dragon Tavern. It is buying our obedience. They want to make our elected officials their puppets. To enforce these new laws and crush the rampant smuggling in Boston, Parliament authorized writs of assistance, general search warrants that allowed customs officials to search any house, ship, or warehouse at any time without specific cause. This violation of the sanctity of private property was seen as a profound assault on the rights of every Englishman. The resistance was swift. A second, better organized boycott of British goods swept the colonies. But the situation in Boston escalated from political to military. To crush the boycott and protect the reviled customs officials, the Crown made a fateful decision. In October 1768, 4 regiments of British regulars, known as Redcoats, were ordered to occupy the city. Boston became a garrison town. The soldiers were not confined to barracks, they were quartered in private homes and public buildings, their presence a constant, arrogant reminder of imperial authority. The sight of British military patrols on the cobbled streets inflamed every resident. The question was no longer about money, but about occupation.
Part 28. Blood on the Snow, March 5, 1770. The military occupation turned Samuel Alden's home into a powder keg. Every day brought fresh friction. Redcoats competed for off-duty jobs, driving down wages. They insulted citizens, and they openly violated colonial law under the protection of martial force. The tension peaked on the frigid night of March 5, 1770. A crowd of restless dock workers, sailors, and apprentices gathered outside the customs house, pelting a lone British sentry with snowballs, stones, and chunks of ice. The crowd, emboldened by defiance and perhaps by drink, grew larger and angrier, shouting threats and daring the sentry to fire. Captain Thomas Preston marched a small squad of 8 redcoats to the sentry's defense, forming a semicircle around the customs house steps. Samuel Alden, alerted by the clamor, pushed his way to the edge of the crowd. He saw the gleam of bayonets and the rising panic in the eyes of the British soldiers. The crowd pressed in, their voices a roar of insults. "Fire, if you dare!" Suddenly, a club struck one of the soldiers, knocking him down. In the chaos, a voice, it was never clear whose, shouted, "Fire!" A musket shot cracked, then another, and another. The soldiers discharged a volley into the compact mass of citizens. When the smoke cleared, 5 men lay dead or dying on the blood-soaked snow. The first casualty was Crispus Attucks, a man of mixed Wampanoag and African heritage, hailed immediately as the first martyr to the cause of liberty. The event, which was legally a confused riot, was immediately branded by the Sons of Liberty as the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere quickly created a sensationalized engraving, a piece of brilliant propaganda showing the soldiers firing a murderous ordered volley into a peaceful crowd. Governor Hutchinson was forced to remove the troops from the city center to an island fort to prevent an all-out revolt. For the British, this was a minor act of crowd control gone tragically wrong.
For Samuel Alden and the colonies, it was murder. The argument for taxes had just been replaced by the argument for life and liberty itself. The Crown could not merely tax them without consent, it would shoot them too. In the ensuing trial, the soldiers were defended by John Adams, who argued that even in the pursuit of liberty, the rule of law must be upheld. Most soldiers were acquitted, but 2 were convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter. The verdict demonstrated to the world that the colonists were committed to justice, even when it cost them a chance at pure vengeance. The Townshend Acts, except for the symbolic duty on tea, were soon repealed, again due to the successful colonial boycott. A tense, fragile calm settled over the colonies. The British had backed down on taxation, but they had left a scar, a permanent, bloody image that convinced many Americans that Parliament was not merely clumsy, but was willing to use violence to enforce tyranny.
Part 29. The Fire of Unity, 1772. The repeal of the Townshend Acts, save for the tea duty, had bought Parliament 3 years of uneasy quiet. But for Samuel Alden, the silence was only the pressure building inside the powder keg. The redcoats were gone from Boston's center, yet the principle remained. Parliament claimed absolute power over the colonists. Samuel found his anxiety mirrored in the escalating actions of the Royal Navy. Since the massacre, their revenue ships had grown increasingly aggressive in their hunt for smugglers. One such vessel, the HMS Gaspee, was particularly reviled. Patrolling the waters off Rhode Island, it harassed local merchants and illegally seized their cargo. In June 1772, the Gaspee, in pursuit of a packet boat, ran aground in shallow water near Warwick, Rhode Island. The moment was too perfect to ignore. That same night, a boatload of Providence men, led by merchant John Brown, rowed silently to the stranded ship. They overpowered the crew, wounded the commanding lieutenant, and set the ship on fire, watching it burn down to the waterline, a declaration that not even the King's Navy was safe from colonial outrage. London reacted with predictable fury, declaring the attack treason and announcing that the perpetrators would be shipped to England for trial. This move terrified Samuel Alden and colonial leaders far more than the event itself. Being tried in England meant losing the protection of a local jury and being subjected to the Crown's arbitrary judgment, a profound violation of English liberty. This threat was the final catalyst for unity. Samuel Adams in Boston quickly realized that the colonies could no longer trust the mails or isolated acts of protest. He led the movement to establish the first formal Committee of Correspondence in Massachusetts, linking Boston to the smaller towns. Samuel Alden attended the first major meeting. "We must share information," Adams declared, his voice rough with conviction. "We must make sure that Rhode Island's outrage becomes Virginia's outrage, and that the latest tyranny in London is known in every hamlet. No more surprises, no more silence." The committees, first established locally and soon linking the various colonies, created a shadow government, a silent, powerful network of coordinated resistance that bypassed the official channels of the royal governors. The Gaspee had burned, but from its ashes, the necessary infrastructure for revolution had been forged. Part 30. The Tea in the Harbor, 1773. For a year, the committees of correspondence practiced their trade, sharpening their political rhetoric and coordinating their boycotts. The last surviving symbol of Parliament's taxing authority was the small duty on tea. In 1773, Parliament, attempting to solve a crisis of its own making, passed the Tea Act. The massive British East India Company was collapsing, drowning in millions of pounds of unsold tea. The act was a bailout. It granted the company a monopoly on the American tea trade,
and allowed it to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing English wholesalers. This meant the company's tea, even with the hated Townsend duty attached, would be cheaper than the Dutch tea Samuel Alden and his merchant colleagues were smuggling. The colonists saw the trap immediately. They do not seek money, they seek submission, Samuel Adams argued. They want us to swallow the principle of taxation hidden inside a cheap cup of tea. The resistance became a siege. When the first tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor in late 1773, the Sons of Liberty refused to let them unload. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, whose own sons were consignees for the tea, refused to grant them permission to leave port without paying the duty. The ships sat in the harbor, deadlocked for 20 days. The deadline for the customs officials to seize the tea for non-payment of duty was midnight, December 16th. If the tea was landed, the tax was paid, and the principal was lost. On the night of the 16th, Samuel Alden answered the urgent summons. He met with dozens of other men in the dark, gathering at the Green Dragon Tavern. They smeared their faces with soot and red ochre and wrapped themselves in blankets, loosely disguising themselves as Mohawk Indians, a visual protest meant to symbolize a break with the constraints of civilized British law. Armed with hatchets and clubs, Samuel marched with the silent column of men to Griffin's Wharf. He boarded the Dartmouth. In an act of disciplined defiance, they swiftly secured the ship. They demanded the keys to the hold, pulled 342 massive chests of tea onto the deck, and systematically smashed them open. Samuel stood at the railing, swinging his hatchet to shred the canvas sack inside a chest. The air was thick with the scent of fine Bohea and Congo tea. He recalled the soldiers firing on the unarmed crowd in 1770, the contempt of the British officers during the war, and the burning HMS Gaspee years earlier. The destruction was necessary. For 3 hours, the only sound was the rhythmic thud of hatchets and the splash of tea hitting the frigid harbor water. The act was precise. Nothing was stolen, no other property was damaged, and they swept the decks clean when they were done. It was an act of political vandalism, not larceny. The next morning, Boston awoke to the news. The harbor smelled faintly of tea, and the Sons of Liberty celebrated. The Crown, however, could not ignore this open, willful destruction of £1 million worth of property. The Tea Party was not a protest. It was an act of open rebellion. London would retaliate with fury, and Samuel Alden knew as he wiped the ochre from his face that they had just crossed a terrifying, irreversible line. The time for peaceful debate was over.
Part 31. The Intolerable Acts, 1774. The news of the Boston Tea Party, delivered across the Atlantic by swift package ships, struck the government of King George III not as an act of protest, but as an act of war. The destruction of property on this scale was seen as the final breakdown of colonial authority. Parliament, led by Prime Minister Lord North, decided that Boston must be made an example of, lest the entire imperial system unravel. In the spring of 1774, Parliament passed a series of punitive laws known in Britain as the Coercive Acts, but which the colonists instantly branded the Intolerable Acts. These acts were designed to isolate and cripple Massachusetts, specifically targeting the rebellious city of Boston. The first and most devastating was the Boston Port Act. It shut down Boston Harbor completely, effective June 1, 1774, until the colonists paid back the East India Company for the destroyed tea. Boston, the city whose lifeblood was commerce, was instantly strangled. The second act struck at the heart of colonial self-governance, the Massachusetts Government Act. It effectively revoked the Massachusetts Charter, banning all town meetings not authorized by the royal governor and replacing the colony's elected governing council with one appointed by the crown. This placed Massachusetts under direct military rule. The third, the Administration of Justice Act, was quickly dubbed the Murder Act by the colonists. It stipulated that any British official or soldier accused of a capital crime while enforcing laws in Massachusetts could be shipped to Britain or another colony for trial. This was done under the pretense of preventing unfair trials, but to Samuel Alden, it meant the soldiers could literally get away with murder, just as they nearly did after the Boston Massacre. To enforce these draconian laws, Parliament installed General Thomas Gage, the commander-in-chief of all British forces in North America, as the new military governor of Massachusetts. Gage arrived in Boston with fresh regiments, turning the already tense city into a fortress. When the news of the Port Act reached the rest of the colonies, the intended effect, isolation, failed spectacularly. From New York to South Carolina, colonial leaders realized the acts were not just an attack on Boston, but a blueprint for tyranny that could be applied to any colony. The committees of correspondence, the network forged after the Gaspee incident, sprang into coordinated action. They began sending food and supplies overland to starving Boston and issued the urgent call that would change the course of history. Part 31. The Intolerable Acts, 1774.
Part 32. The Carpenter's Hall, 1774. The crisis demanded a unified front, something never before achieved by the 13 disparate colonies. In response to the Intolerable Acts, 12 colonies, Georgia notably abstained, agreed to send delegates to Philadelphia to discuss a common course of action. Samuel Alden, elected as a delegate for Massachusetts, rode south in the late summer, carrying the desperate plea of his blockaded city. The First Continental Congress convened on September 5, 1774, in Philadelphia's Carpenter's Hall. It was a collection of the most brilliant, cautious, and radical minds in North America. Samuel Alden sat beside towering figures he had only read about: the reserved lawyer John Adams, Massachusetts, the fiery orator Patrick Henry, Virginia, and the measured, commanding planter George Washington, Virginia. The mood was a tense mix of defiance and deep loyalty. Most delegates, especially the moderates from the middle colonies, still clung to the hope of reconciliation with King George III. They were not revolutionaries seeking independence. They were Englishmen defending their traditional rights against a tyrannical parliament. The debates were fierce. Samuel Alden, speaking on behalf of besieged Boston, advocated for strong, uncompromising action, while others urged patience and diplomacy. The Congress ultimately took two powerful and decisive steps: the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. They asserted that the colonists were entitled to all the rights of Englishmen, particularly the right to assemble, petition, have standing armies only with their consent, and, most crucially, the right of exclusive legislation in their provincial legislatures, meaning only their own assemblies could tax them. Critically, the declaration ended by confirming their loyalty to the crown. The Continental Association. This was the masterstroke of colonial unity. It established a comprehensive, three-pronged plan of non-importation, no British goods; non-exportation, no American goods to Britain or the West Indies; and non-consumption, a total boycott of all British products. The association was to be enforced not just by politicians, but by local committees of inspection in every county and town, effectively creating a revolutionary government infrastructure at the grassroots level.
The First Continental Congress was a functional declaration of American political union. It ended on October 26, 1774, with a solemn promise. If the intolerable acts were not repealed and their grievances addressed, the delegates would meet again in May 1775. Samuel Alden returned to Boston, knowing two things. The whole continent now stood with his city, and they had given the king one final ultimatum. The question was no longer if they would fight, but when the fighting would begin.
Part 33. Gathering the Arms. Winter 1774, Spring 1775. Back in Massachusetts, Governor and Commander-in-Chief General Thomas Gage found his authority confined to the immediate reach of his cannon in Boston. The intolerable acts had not isolated the colony, they had driven it into open defiance. The royal charter was void, but the colony's governance did not stop. The legally dissolved general courts simply regrouped 40 miles away in the town of Concord, renaming itself the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. Samuel Alden, having returned from the unifying atmosphere of Philadelphia, threw himself into the preparations for the inevitable clash. He was now a key member of the Committee of Safety, the body tasked with securing the colony's military posture. Under the Provincial Congress's direction, the focus shifted from political protest to armed defense. Every town was ordered to raise and train its militia, organizing special companies of Minutemen, younger, fitter men who promised to be ready to fight at a minute's notice. This was grassroots mobilization on an unprecedented scale. Every farmer, craftsman, and merchant was expected to keep his musket clean and his powder dry. Meanwhile, Gage watched with growing frustration from Boston. He sent out spies disguised as colonists to chart the roads, bridges, and, most importantly, the locations where the rebels were stockpiling their military supplies. The biggest cache of powder, cannons, and muskets was reported to be in the town of Concord, the very heart of the revolutionary Provincial Congress. London, impatient with Gage's perceived inaction, sent explicit orders: crush the rebellion by seizing the arms and arresting the ringleaders, specifically Samuel Adams and wealthy merchant John Hancock, both of whom were known to be staying just outside Boston in Lexington. The trap was set. Samuel Alden, privy to the Committee of Safety's frantic counterintelligence efforts, felt the air in Boston thicken with tension. Everyone knew a move was coming. The only mystery was the precise hour. Part 34. The Shot Heard Round the World. April 19, 1775. The moment arrived on the evening of April 18, 1775. General Gage deployed roughly 700 crack British regulars, marching them silently out of Boston under the cover of darkness. Their mission? March the 20 miles inland to Concord, seize the colonial weapons cache, and, en route, arrest Adams and Hancock in Lexington. The American Counterintelligence Network was already active. The Sons of Liberty had arranged a signal system based on the North Church steeple, 1 if by land and 2 if by sea. Seeing 2 lanterns hung, meaning the British were crossing the Charles River by boat, Paul Revere and William Doss instantly began their separate rides to warn the countryside. Revere, Doss, and later Dr. Samuel Prescott rode through the night, rousing farmhouses and hamlets with their terrifying message: the regulars are out. Samuel Alden, who was in Lexington, working to secure Adams and Hancock, heard the panicked shouts and the thunder of hoofbeats just after midnight. He and a few others barely managed to get the 2 leaders away moments before the British column, led by Major John Pitcairn, arrived.
The British found their first organized resistance on the Lexington Green just after dawn. 77 local militiamen, led by Captain John Parker, stood arrayed across the common. Pitcairn rode forward, shouting, "Disperse, ye villains, ye rebels, disperse!" The Americans were heavily outnumbered, and Parker had ordered them merely to stand their ground, not to engage. Then, in the tense, confused confrontation, an unknown shot rang out, the shot heard round the world. Instinct and terror took over. The Redcoats fired a volley, followed by another. The militiamen scattered, leaving 8 of their own dead and 10 wounded on the green. The British cheered their victory and marched on toward Concord. Samuel Alden, having watched the blood spilled in Lexington, rode immediately to Concord. By the time the British arrived, most of the colonial supplies had been hidden or moved. As the Redcoats secured the town, thousands of militiamen from surrounding towns, farmers, lawyers, boys, were arriving at forming ranks on the hills overlooking the North Bridge. At the bridge, a minor British patrol fired on the colonials, and this time the Americans fired back. The Redcoats retreated in disarray. The regulars now realized they were surrounded. The 20-mile march back to Boston became a brutal, relentless gauntlet. Minutemen firing from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings in classic guerrilla fashion turned the road into a slaughterhouse. Samuel Alden, gripping his own musket, took shelter behind a stone fence and fired shot after shot at the fleeing column of scarlet coats. This was not a battle for a principle, it was desperate, bloody defense of their homes. By the time the Redcoats stumbled back into the relative safety of Boston, they had suffered nearly 275 casualties. The fighting was disorganized, frantic, and unplanned, but the meaning was clear. The American War of Independence had begun. Boston was instantly besieged by thousands of enraged colonials, and Samuel Alden found himself a soldier in an army that didn't officially exist. Part 35. The Creation of an Army, May through June 1775. The smoke from the long march from Concord had barely settled when Massachusetts became the epicenter of a continental crisis. Thousands of militiamen, the country folk, poured onto the narrow neck of land surrounding Boston. They weren't a standing army, but a swarm of armed, angry men who had spontaneously encircled the garrison fortress. General Gage and his now 6,000 soldiers were prisoners in their own fortress. On May 10, 1775, the delegates of the colonies reconvened in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. The mood was starkly different from the previous fall. Then they debated boycotts. Now they debated war. Samuel Alden returned to Carpenter's Hall wearing the grim determination of a man who had seen his neighbors fall and had himself traded his pen for a musket. The Congress faced a profound contradiction. They were fighting a war, yet most delegates were terrified of formal independence. The moderates, led by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, pushed for one final plea to the king. The result was the Olive Branch Petition, an eloquent letter reaffirming loyalty to George III and humbly asking him to intercede to stop the bloodshed caused by Parliament's ministers.
But the petition was largely a stalling tactic for the radicals. The war demanded a unified force. On June 14, 1775, Congress took the momentous step of adopting the motley collection of New England militiamen besieging Boston and transforming them into the Continental Army. The next, and arguably most important decision, was choosing a commander. The New England delegates expected one of their own to lead, but John Adams recognized that the cause needed a national figure to unify the disparate colonies and reassure the skeptical Southern states. He nominated George Washington of Virginia. Washington, silent in his uniform of a Virginia colonel, was elected unanimously. Washington was instantly given a commission and ordered to ride north to take command in Massachusetts. He left Philadelphia immediately his presence itself a powerful symbol that the conflict was no longer Boston's local rebellion, but America's united cause. The Continental Congress, initially an assembly of protest, had become a provisional government, taking on the authority to raise armies, issue currency, and prosecute a war. This was, in all but name, the birth of a new nation. Part 36. The Hills of Charlestown, June 17, 1775. In Boston, General Thomas Gage's frustration was acute. His garrison was swollen with recent reinforcements and 3 new major generals, William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, who arrived with fresh orders to crush the colonial rabble. But the regulars were bottled up, held hostage by thousands of farmers and tradesmen surrounding the city. Gage, under pressure, planned a move to seize the high ground on the Charlestown Peninsula to the north. The Americans moved first. On the night of June 16th, under the cover of darkness, American forces under Colonel William Prescott marched onto the peninsula. Their goal was Bunker Hill, the higher of the 2 major elevations, but Prescott pushed them forward to the more strategically dominant Breed's Hill, closer to the city. Working through the night, they hastily constructed a formidable earthen redoubt. Samuel Alden, who had volunteered with his local company after Concord, was among the weary men digging in on Breed's Hill. When the sun rose on June 17th, the British command was stunned to see a newly built fort overlooking the city and its harbor. The cannonade began immediately, turning the pastoral hills into a hellscape of smoke and flying dirt. General Howe, refusing to believe that such crude soldiers could stand against his veterans, decided on a direct, frontal assault. He marched his 2,400 men across the narrow neck of land, separating the peninsula from the mainland, their bright red coats a shocking, arrogant line in the green summer fields. As the British formations advanced, the American officers issued their legendary order, born of desperation and a crippling shortage of gunpowder: "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Samuel Alden crouched behind the redoubt wall, his heart hammering in his chest, the smoke of the burning Charlestown neighborhood drifting over them. He could clearly see the faces of the soldiers, sweating, grim, professional, as they approached in perfect formation. At last, the order came.
The effect was devastating. The Americans unleashed a synchronized point-blank volley into the packed British ranks. The front line of the assault was simply scythe-bound. Howe ordered a retreat, reorganized, and ordered a second charge. The Americans held their fire, waited, and again shattered the formation with another deadly volley. The Redcoats retreated a second time, leaving the hillside littered with bodies. But the Americans were nearly out of ammunition. When the British charged for a third time, bayonets fixed, the Minutemen's muskets were silent. Samuel and his comrades fought hand to hand until they were forced to scramble in a desperate, disorganized retreat, fleeing across Bunker Hill and back toward the mainland. The British had taken the ground, a tactical victory, but the cost was catastrophic. Over 1,000 Redcoats killed or wounded, including a disproportionate number of officers. The Americans lost around 450 men, but their morale soared. The Battle of Bunker Hill proved that the rabble were not only willing to fight, but could inflict staggering losses on the world's best army. Though they lost the hill, the Americans had won a profound psychological victory, convincing the colonies that the war, however long, could be won. Part 37. The Arrival of the Virginian, July 1775 to March 1776. The day after the Battle of Bunker Hill, General George Washington was already riding north, unaware of the bloody victory that awaited him. He arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts on July 3, 1775. His destination was the venerable Washington Elm on the Cambridge Common, where with great ceremony
he drew his sword and formally took command of the newly christened Continental Army. Samuel Alden was there, exhausted and covered in the grime of the retreat from Breed's Hill, watching the Virginian arrive. Washington was an imposing figure, tall, severe, and radiating an authority that immediately calmed the chaotic camp. He was instantly appalled by what he found. 16,000 men were besieging Boston, but they were not an army. They were disorganized, ill-disciplined, and worst of all, their enlistment terms were set to expire at the end of the year. "I found a mixed multitude," Washington wrote in frustration, "under very little discipline, order, or government." Washington spent the next 9 months executing the siege of Boston, a strategy less about fighting and more about transforming the mixed multitude into a professional fighting force. He established courts-martial, enforced discipline, and personally rode the lines daily, projecting an image of unflappable strength. The British, now under the command of General Howe, who replaced the disgraced Gage, remained trapped in Boston, able to supply themselves only by sea. The key to breaking the stalemate arrived in the form of a 25-year-old Boston bookseller turned artilleryman. Henry Knox, in the dead of winter, was dispatched on a legendary mission to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, which had recently been captured. His task was to secure the heavy artillery stored there. Knox orchestrated the noble train of artillery, an impossible undertaking that saw him haul 60 tons of cannons and mortars, some of them 5,000 pounds each, nearly 300 miles across frozen mountain ranges and the Hudson River. The journey took 56 grueling days. When the massive guns finally arrived near Boston in February 1776, Washington seized the opportunity. He ordered them dragged up to Dorchester Heights, a massive elevation overlooking Boston Harbor from the south. The maneuver was executed overnight on March 4th, with a vast coordinated effort of soldiers, engineers, and oxen, masking the noise with continuous diversionary fire. When General Howe awoke on March 5th, the anniversary of the Boston Massacre, he looked up and saw the American artillery staring down at his ships and his city. Dorchester Heights made Boston completely indefensible. Howe realized he could not risk the destruction of his ships and the slaughter of his men. With a tacit understanding reached between the two generals, Howe chose evacuation over battle. On March 17, 1776, the entire British garrison, along with 1,000 loyalists who feared colonial vengeance, boarded ships and sailed away, bound for Halifax, Nova Scotia. Samuel Alden watched from the main line as the last ship faded into the Atlantic mist. Boston, the cradle of the Revolution, was free. It was the first major American victory of the war, achieved not by a bloody charge, but by strategic brilliance, relentless logistics, and the sheer will of its new commander. Washington had proven that the Continental Army, now disciplined and armed, was capable of winning a true campaign. The next step was formal separation.
Part 38. The Voice of Separation. January to June 1776. The next step was not taken by a general, but by a writer. For months, even as men died at Lexington and Bunker Hill, the fundamental argument in the Continental Congress had remained stalled. Were they fighting for reconciliation with the king or for independence? General Washington had freed Boston, but the politicians in Philadelphia still wrestled with the very concept of treason. The deadlock was broken by a pamphlet published anonymously in January 1776. Its author was Thomas Paine, a recent English immigrant and intellectual firebrand who had arrived in America barely a year earlier. The title was blunt and revolutionary: Common Sense. Paine's timing was perfect, and his prose was simple, direct, and devastating. He did not write in the formal legal language of lawyers and politicians. He wrote in the language of the common man, appealing not to history, but to natural law and moral necessity. Samuel Alden, reading the pamphlet circulated rapidly through the army camps, was astonished by its clarity. Paine stripped away the reverence for the monarchy that still held many delegates captive. He called George III a royal brute and systematically dismantled the entire concept of hereditary rule, arguing that it was ridiculous for a continent to be governed by an island. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth, Paine wrote, demanding an immediate break with Britain. The period of debate is closed. Arms, as the last resource, decide the contest. Common Sense was the publishing phenomenon of the age, selling an estimated 500,000 copies to a colonial population of 2.5 million. It achieved what Congress had been unable to do. It converted the American crisis from a legal dispute over taxes into a moral crusade against tyranny. When the delegates reconvened in the spring of 1776, the political landscape had irrevocably shifted. The question was no longer if they should declare independence, but how and when. Part 39. The Great Decision. June to July, 1776. In June 1776, Samuel Alden was again in Philadelphia, now serving as an observer in the anxious, heat-filled halls near the State House. The intellectual groundwork laid by Paine had finally translated into political action. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stood before the Congress and introduced a resolution that cut through all remaining ambiguity, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The formal debate began the next day, conducted in secrecy, with the windows of the State House sealed shut against the oppressive summer humidity. The conservative delegates fought furiously, still fearing the loss of British protection and the chaos of an inevitable full-scale war. But the momentum was unstoppable. Congress appointed a committee of 5 to draft a formal declaration to explain their decision to the world. The members were Thomas Jefferson, Massachusetts; John Adams, Virginia; Benjamin Franklin, Pennsylvania; Roger Sherman, Connecticut; and Robert Livingston, New York. The task of writing fell primarily to Jefferson, a young Virginian known for his eloquent classical prose. Working tirelessly, Jefferson composed a document that was far more than a statement of separation. It was a universal assertion of human rights. Samuel Alden read the early draft with awe. It contained the soaring, unforgettable phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." On July 2nd, 1776, after striking out a lengthy section condemning the slave trade to appease the Southern delegates, Congress voted, adopting Lee's resolution of independence. The colonies had formally severed ties with Great Britain. 2 days later, on July 4th, Congress formally adopted Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. John Hancock, the President of Congress, signed the document first with a flourish so large he famously declared, "King George can read that without his spectacles." The delegates in signing were committing the ultimate act of treason, securing their fate not only to independence, but to the hangman's noose if they failed. The revolution had finally been fully and formally declared, but as messengers rode out of Philadelphia with copies of the Declaration, the reality was stark. The Declaration was an empty promise until Washington and the Continental Army could prove that they could enforce it against the might of the British Empire.
Part 40. The Fall of New York. August-September 1776. In the weeks leading up to the Declaration, General Washington had already anticipated the inevitable British response. New York City, with its excellent deep-water harbor and central location, was the obvious next target. Immediately after the British evacuation of Boston, Washington marched his army south to fortify the city. The scale of the British retaliation was overwhelming. By mid-August 1776, the largest expeditionary force Great Britain had ever assembled, more than 32,000 professional soldiers, including thousands of Hessian mercenaries,
supported by a massive fleet of warships, was anchored in New York Harbor. General William Howe, fresh off the defeat in Boston, was in command. Washington, by contrast, had roughly 19,000 men, poorly trained, poorly supplied, and spread thinly between Manhattan and Long Island. Samuel Alden was now serving in a Massachusetts regiment attached to Washington's forces on Long Island. He watched the vast enemy fleet with mounting dread. The British objective was not merely to take the city, but to destroy the Continental Army in a single, decisive blow. The confrontation began with the Battle of Long Island on August 27th. Washington made a disastrous strategic error by dividing his army, placing a significant portion across the East River on Long Island. General Howe, utilizing superior intelligence, executed a brilliant flanking maneuver, marching 10,000 of his soldiers undetected around the American left flank. Samuel Alden's unit found itself caught in a desperate rearguard action, fighting a hopeless battle to prevent the British from capturing the entire American force. The battle was a rout. The Americans suffered over 1,000 casualties, and the remaining 9,000 troops were quickly pinned against the Brooklyn shore. Howe had them trapped. Washington, watching the disaster unfold from Manhattan, realized that if he did not act immediately, the entire American cause would die there on the Brooklyn Heights. In what would become a legendary feat of generalship, Washington organized a secret, desperate nighttime evacuation. Under the cover of a thick fog that descended on the night of August 29th to 30th, and utilizing every available boat, Washington ferried all 9,000 of his remaining troops, their horses, and their remaining supplies across the East River to Manhattan. Samuel Alden was one of the last men to cross, turning back to see Washington himself standing on the shore, refusing to leave until the last boat was loaded. When General Howe finally discovered the escape in the morning, the fog had lifted and the American army was gone. Howe had won the battle in the city of New York, but he had failed to win the war. Washington had lost a critical strategic port, but had saved the Continental Army, preserving the one thing the new nation could not replace. The fall of New York signaled the end of the rebellion's honeymoon and the beginning of a desperate, grueling war of survival.
Part 40. The Fall of New York, August to September 1776. In the weeks leading up to the Declaration, General Washington had already anticipated the inevitable British response. New York City, with its excellent deep-water harbor and central location, was the obvious next target. Immediately after the British evacuation of Boston, Washington marched his army south to fortify the city. The scale of the British retaliation was overwhelming. By mid-August 1776, the largest expeditionary force Great Britain had ever assembled, more than 32,000 professional soldiers, including thousands of Hessian mercenaries, supported by a massive fleet of warships, was anchored in New York Harbor. General William Howe, fresh off the defeat in Boston, was in command. Washington, by contrast, had roughly 19,000 men, poorly trained, poorly supplied, and spread thinly between Manhattan and Long Island. Samuel Alden was now serving in a Massachusetts regiment attached to Washington's forces on Long Island. He watched the vast enemy fleet with mounting dread. The British objective was not merely to take the city, but to destroy the Continental Army in a single decisive blow. The confrontation began with the Battle of Long Island on August 27th. Washington made a disastrous strategic error by dividing his army, placing a significant portion across the East River on Long Island. General Howe, utilizing superior intelligence, executed a brilliant flanking maneuver, marching 10,000 of his soldiers undetected around the American left flank. Samuel Alden's unit found itself caught in a desperate rearguard action, fighting a hopeless battle to prevent the British from capturing the entire American force. The battle was a rout. The Americans suffered over 1,000 casualties, and the remaining 9,000 troops were quickly pinned against the Brooklyn shore. Howe had them trapped. Washington, watching the disaster unfold from Manhattan, realized that if he did not act immediately, the entire American cause would die there on the Brooklyn Heights. In what would become a legendary feat of generalship, Washington organized a secret, desperate nighttime evacuation under the cover of a thick fog that descended on the night of August 29th through 30th, and utilizing every available boat, Washington ferried all 9,000 of his remaining troops, their horses, and their remaining supplies across the East River to Manhattan. Samuel Alden was one of the last men to cross, turning back to see Washington himself standing on the shore, refusing to leave until the last boat was loaded. When General Howe finally discovered the escape in the morning, the fog had lifted and the American army was gone. Howe had won the battle and the city of New York, but he had failed to win the war. Washington had lost a critical strategic port, but had saved the Continental Army, preserving the one thing the new nation could not replace. The fall of New York signaled the end of the rebellion's honeymoon and the beginning of a desperate, grueling war of survival. Part 41. Retreat across the Jerseys, September to December 1776. The evacuation to Manhattan only offered a temporary respite. General Howe, now in full control of the harbor, began his systematic conquest of the island. On September 15th, British forces landed at Kipps Bay on the eastern shore of Manhattan. The American militia defending the area broke and ran in a humiliating rout, forcing Washington in a rare fit of public rage to draw his pistol and threaten to shoot the fleeing men. Samuel Alden was part of the Continental forces that managed a small but vital counterattack the next day at the Battle of Harlem Heights. While not a decisive victory, this minor success stabilized the collapsing American morale and bought Washington time to pull the bulk of his army north, avoiding encirclement. The retreat continued up through Manhattan and across the mainland into New York. The British followed closely, defeating a portion of Washington's army again at the Battle of White Plains in late October. The final crushing blow of the campaign came in mid-November with the loss of Fort Washington on the upper tip of Manhattan. With the fort fell nearly 3,000 American soldiers, captured along with massive quantities of supplies and artillery. With Manhattan and all of New York now firmly in British hands, Washington was forced to begin a desperate, frantic retreat across New Jersey, the retreat across the Jerseys. His army, ragged, starving, unpaid, and numbering barely 6,000 men, was hounded by the pursuing British columns and their Hessian mercenaries. Morale collapsed. Entire regiments' terms of enlistment expired, and men simply picked up their rifles and walked home. Thomas Paine, now serving with the Army, summed up the mood in a new pamphlet, The American Crisis, published just as Washington's defeated force crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. By December 1776, the American cause seemed finished. The Continental Army was a wreck, the Congress had fled Philadelphia for Baltimore, and the British believed the war was effectively over. Washington knew he needed a miracle, or the Declaration of Independence would be nothing more than a failed piece of revolutionary propaganda.
Part 42. The 10 Crucial Days, December 1776 to January 1777. The fate of the Revolution rested entirely upon a frozen river. George Washington's army sat shivering on the west bank of the Delaware River in Pennsylvania, looking across the icy moving water at their enemies. Most of his remaining troops' enlistments were set to expire on December 31st. Without a victory, the army would cease to exist. Washington formulated a desperate, high-risk plan.
On Christmas Day, 1776, while the British and their Hessian garrisons lay scattered across New Jersey, celebrating the holiday and anticipating the end of the campaign season, Washington prepared a counterstrike. Under the cover of a freezing winter storm of sleet and snow, Washington began the arduous task of crossing the Delaware River in Durham boats, a maneuver only possible due to the expert seamanship of Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Regiment. Samuel Alden was among the 2,400 troops who made the crossing. It was a 9-hour nightmare of ice floes, freezing water, and blinding weather. The crossing was completed near dawn on December 26th. The Americans then marched 9 miles to Trenton, New Jersey, where a garrison of about 1,400 Hessian troops were quartered, unprepared for any attack. The resulting Battle of Trenton lasted barely an hour. The American attack caught the Hessians completely by surprise, sweeping into the town from 2 directions. The Americans secured a stunning and badly needed victory, capturing nearly 1,000 Hessians with virtually no losses of their own. But Washington knew one victory was not enough. He crossed back into Pennsylvania, but then, seeing the immediate boost in morale, he gambled again. He crossed the Delaware back into New Jersey, attracting the immediate attention of General Cornwallis, who rushed to Trenton to crush him. On the night of January 2nd, 1777, with Cornwallis's massive army deployed directly in front of him, Washington left his campfires burning and slipped his entire force silently around the British flank. The next morning, at the Battle of Princeton, Washington smashed 3 regiments of British regulars. In a span of 10 days, Washington had defeated 2 separate British forces, revived American morale, and secured massive supplies of desperately needed arms and food. The 10 crucial days had transformed the war. The Continental Army had been saved, the cause of independence was suddenly viable again, and George Washington was hailed across the colonies as a military genius. Part 43. The Battle for the Capital and the Northern Triumph, 1777. The successes at Trenton and Princeton bought the Continental Army 6 months of breathing room, but the strategic situation remained dire. In 1777, the British command devised a grand strategy to end the rebellion. General Burgoyne would lead an army south from Canada, connecting with British forces moving north up the Hudson River, thereby severing New England, the heart of the Revolution, from the rest of the colonies. Meanwhile, Howe would target the political capital, Philadelphia. Howe struck first. In late summer, he moved his main force by sea, landing in Chesapeake Bay and beginning the march north toward Philadelphia. Washington positioned his army at Brandywine Creek to block the advance, but was outmaneuvered by Howe, suffering a significant defeat on September 11th. Samuel Alden, enduring the heavy casualties, described the retreat as more orderly than the previous year, but the result was the same, the loss of ground. On September 26, 1776, British troops marched into Philadelphia. The Continental Congress was forced to flee once more, this time west to York, Pennsylvania. Washington, desperate to retake the initiative, launched a complex 4-pronged surprise attack against the main British encampment at Germantown in early October. The attack initially succeeded, but heavy fog, combined with American confusion and poor coordination, turned the tide. Washington was defeated again. The army then retreated to a place called Valley Forge to set up winter quarters, beaten but not broken. While Washington endured defeat in the middle colonies, the northern campaign was unfolding differently. General Burgoyne, burdened with 8,000 men, lavish baggage, and a slow pace through the wilderness, was constantly harassed by American militia. His supply lines were stretched thin, culminating in a disastrous foraging raid that was crushed at the Battle of Bennington. By October, Burgoyne found himself surrounded near Saratoga, New York, by a rapidly growing American army commanded by General Horatio Gates and critically led in the field by the aggressive General Benedict Arnold. After 2 fierce engagements at Freeman's Farms and Bemis Heights, Burgoyne's entire army was trapped. On October 17, 1777, General Burgoyne was forced to surrender his entire force, the first time a full British army had ever laid down its arms in history. The Battle of Saratoga was the decisive turning point of the war. News of the victory, carried swiftly across the Atlantic, proved to the European powers, especially France, that the American rebels were capable of winning, and that openly supporting them was a calculated risk worth taking.
Part 44, Valley Forge and the French Alliance, 1777 to 1778. Following the defeats outside Philadelphia, the Continental Army withdrew to winter quarters at Valley Forge, a high, easily defensible plateau northwest of the captured city. For 6 months, from December 1777 to June 1778, the 12,000 soldiers endured one of the harshest periods of the war. The winter itself was not the coldest, but the conditions were brutal due to catastrophic logistics failure. The men, including Samuel Alden, lived in crudely built log huts, often sharing a single blanket among 3 or 4 soldiers. They lacked food, clothing, and medicine. At any given time, thousands were too sick or improperly clothed to drill. The supply system was broken, controlled by greedy contractors who preferred to sell provisions to the British in Philadelphia for hard currency rather than to the Continental Army for worthless paper. Washington fought daily battles against the Congress and against mutiny to keep his army intact. Over 2,000 soldiers died that winter from disease, hunger, and exposure. Amidst this suffering, a crucial foreigner arrived. Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian military officer, offered his services to Washington. Though he had limited command experience, von Steuben was a master drill master and quickly began the difficult process of turning the ragged, ill-disciplined American units into a cohesive fighting force. He drafted a simplified manual of arms in French, which was translated into English by Alexander Hamilton and Nathaniel Greene. Through relentless, profanity-laced instruction, he standardized marching formations, musketry, and bayonet drills, skills that would prove invaluable. In May 1778, the suffering came to an abrupt end with 2 momentous events. First, the supply lines finally improved, and the weather broke, allowing the men to shed their tattered rags. Second, news arrived from Paris. France had formally recognized American independence. The Treaty of Alliance, signed February 6, 1778, was Franklin's masterpiece. It brought French military and financial aid, including a powerful French fleet, into the war against Britain, transforming the conflict from a colonial rebellion into a global war. The British military command, facing a new war front in the Caribbean and Europe, was forced to reassess its strategy. The American soldiers at Valley Forge celebrated the news with cannon salutes and parades. The Continental Army, having survived its darkest hour, was now a professional force backed by the power of the French crown. Part 45, Monmouth and the Stalemate in the North, 1778. The entrance of France into the war immediately altered British strategy. General William Howe, criticized for his slow campaigns, resigned and was replaced by General Sir Henry Clinton. Clinton's primary order was to abandon Philadelphia and consolidate all British forces in New York City, as the city was a more defensible hub against the anticipated French fleet. On June 18, 1778, the British forces evacuated Philadelphia. Washington immediately moved the newly trained Continental Army out of Valley Forge and pursued the British column across New Jersey. The Americans planned to ambush Clinton's column as it moved toward New York. The resulting Battle of Monmouth, June 28, 1778, proved to be a chaotic, brutal test of the Continental Army's new professionalism.
The American advance, led by General Charles Lee, turned into a disastrous retreat after Lee's questionable orders caused mass confusion. Washington, riding forward in a fury, took personal command, rallied the confused soldiers, and, thanks to the bayonet and drill training imparted by von Steuben, successfully held the line against the veteran British regulars. The battle ended in a tactical draw, fought to a standstill in sweltering heat. However, strategically, it was a major American victory. The Continental Army had proven they could fight toe-to-toe with the British regulars in a pitched battle and hold the field. Under the cover of darkness, Clinton's army slipped away to New York. Monmouth was the last major engagement fought in the North. From 1778 onward, the main fighting of the Revolution shifted dramatically. The Americans settled into a long stalemate, bottling the main British army up in New York City, while the British turned their attention to the southern colonies, where they believed Loyalist support was stronger. The war was about to become a brutal internecine struggle.
Part 46. The British Southern Strategy and the Fall of Charleston, 1778 to 1780. With the French fleet threatening their naval superiority in the North Atlantic, the British High Command enacted a new Southern strategy. The plan was to utilize the purported strong Loyalist presence in the southern colonies, capture the key port cities, and then move inland, suppressing the rebellion one state at a time. The campaign began in late 1778. On December 29, 1778, a British expeditionary force easily captured Savannah, Georgia. The American forces defending the city were badly outnumbered and quickly overwhelmed, marking the beginning of a relentless conquest of the South. The major disaster struck in 1780. General Henry Clinton, leaving General Cornwallis in command in New York, personally led a massive force against Charleston, South Carolina, the wealthiest and most important port in the South. The city was surrounded and subjected to a protracted siege. On May 12, 1780, Major General Benjamin Lincoln, commanding the American garrison, was forced to surrender. The fall of Charleston was the single greatest American defeat of the entire war. The British captured over 5,000 soldiers, 4 frigates, and vast quantities of artillery and supplies. With Savannah and Charleston secured, the British effectively controlled the entire coastal region of the Deep South. Clinton returned to New York, leaving Lord Cornwallis in charge of subduing the rest of the Carolinas. With the conventional American forces destroyed or captured, the fighting in the South devolved into a brutal civil war. The British attempted to establish control inland, but they were relentlessly harassed by small, highly effective Patriot guerrilla bands. These irregular fighters, often operating out of the dense swamps and forests, launched hit-and-run attacks on British and Loyalist supply lines. Among the most famous of these leaders was Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, whose ability to strike quickly and disappear into the wilderness frustrated the highly organized British Army. The war in the South became a conflict of neighbor against neighbor, marked by shocking violence and acts of revenge between Patriot and Loyalist militias. Part 47. Camden and Kings Mountain, 1780. Following the catastrophic surrender at Charleston, the Continental Congress, desperately seeking to stabilize the South, appointed General Horatio Gates, the victor of Saratoga, to command the remaining Continental forces. However, Gates proved a disaster in the Southern theater. In August 1780, Gates hastily marched his ill-equipped army of Continental regulars and untrained militia toward a British outpost at Camden, South Carolina. Lord Cornwallis, in command of the British forces, moved to intercept him. The resulting Battle of Camden, August 16, 1780, was a devastating American rout. Gates made several tactical errors, including positioning his weakest, most inexperienced militia on the left flank directly opposite the veteran British regulars. When the British attacked, the American militia immediately broke and fled.
The Continental regulars held for a time, but were soon overwhelmed. The American army in the South was effectively destroyed for a second time. Gates himself fled the battlefield and did not stop until he reached Hillsborough, North Carolina, over 180 miles away, ending his military career. The British felt they were on the verge of total victory in the South. Lord Cornwallis ordered Major Patrick Ferguson, a charismatic loyalist commander, to march into the backcountry of the Carolinas to eliminate Patriot resistance and recruit thousands of new loyalists. Ferguson, overconfident, issued a public threat to the Over-Mountain Men, tough, independent settlers living west of the Appalachian Mountains, warning them to cease their opposition or he would march over the mountains and lay waste to their country. The Over-Mountain Men took the threat personally. In a stunning display of grassroots fury, over 1,000 Patriot militiamen spontaneously gathered crossing the mountains to hunt him down. They cornered his force, consisting entirely of American loyalists, atop Kings Mountain on the border of the Carolinas. The Battle of Kings Mountain, October 7, 1780, was fought entirely between Americans, Patriots versus Loyalists. The Patriots, armed with accurate hunting rifles, repeatedly charged the mountain, firing from behind rocks and trees. Ferguson's Loyalist force, pinned on the summit, was utterly decimated. Ferguson himself was killed, and nearly 700 Loyalists were captured or killed. Kings Mountain was a crucial turning point. It shattered the back of Loyalist recruitment in the Carolinas and forced Cornwallis to abandon his planned invasion of North Carolina, proving that the British could not pacify the interior without immense constant military commitment.
Part 48. Greene's Grand Strategy and the Battle of Cowpens, 1780 to 1781. Following the fiasco at Camden, George Washington took the unusual step of personally selecting a replacement for Gates, choosing General Nathaniel Greene, his most trusted subordinate and former quartermaster general. Greene arrived to take command of the pitiful remnants of the Southern Continental Army in December 1780, famously observing that his troops were literally naked and were living chiefly on water and rice. Greene, a self-taught Quaker general, knew he could not defeat Lord Cornwallis's professional army in a pitched battle. Instead, he adopted a brilliant and unorthodox strategy of attrition and maneuver. He deliberately divided his small force. He sent a flying column under General Daniel Morgan, the hero of Saratoga, west to draw Cornwallis into the backcountry, while Greene maintained the larger main force to the east. The goal was to force the British to fight across vast, difficult terrain and slowly bleed their supplies and manpower. Cornwallis took the bait, dispatching his aggressive British Legion under Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, a commander known for his ruthlessness, to eliminate Morgan's column. Morgan led Tarleton into a pre-selected field known as the Cowpens in western South Carolina. The Battle of Cowpens, January 17, 1781, is considered one of the most brilliant tactical victories of the war. Morgan deployed his small force in 3 distinct lines, instructing his front line of militia to fire 2 volleys and then retreat, drawing the confident British into the second line of Continentals. When the militia appeared to flee, Tarleton ordered a full bayonet charge. As the British advanced, they were caught in a deadly crossfire, surprised by the fleeing militia reforming on the flanks and crushed by a final charge from Morgan's Continental Reserves in cavalry, led by William Washington. Tarleton's legion was virtually annihilated, suffering nearly 900 casualties, while the Americans lost only 25 killed. Cowpens was a devastating, irreversible loss for the British Army in the South. It crippled Cornwallis's light infantry and forced him to dedicate his remaining army to the pursuit of Morgan and Greene. Part 49. The Race to the Dan and Guildford Courthouse, 1781.
The Battle of Cowpens convinced Lord Cornwallis that he had to destroy the American army in the South at all costs. In a desperate move, he ordered the destruction of most of his army's baggage, wagons, and supplies to convert his force into a light infantry column capable of faster pursuit. This decision committed him entirely to the chase, making retreat impossible. General Greene and General Morgan, having reunited their forces, now began the famous race to the Dan River. This was not a panicked flight, but a calculated 200-mile strategic retreat designed to lure Cornwallis deep into hostile North Carolina territory, far from his coastal supply lines. The Americans raced north toward the Dan River, the boundary between North Carolina and Virginia. American supply officers, working weeks in advance, had gathered all the available boats and supplies near the river crossing points. Just as Cornwallis, whose exhausted troops were literally marching barefoot through the freezing mud, reached the riverbank expecting to corner and destroy Greene's army, he found that the last of the American boats had crossed hours earlier. With the river swollen and unfordable, Greene was safe in Virginia, having executed a perfect, complex maneuver. After 2 weeks of rest and resupply in Virginia, Greene felt his force was sufficient to turn and fight. He crossed back into North Carolina, taking a strong defensive position near Guilford Courthouse. On March 15, 1781, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse began. Greene, once again using Morgan's brilliant tactical design, positioned his troops in 3 lines of diminishing quality. The first 2 lines of militia would harass the British and fire only a few volleys before retreating, intended to disorganize and exhaust the advancing enemy before they reached the Continental regulars of the 3rd line. The plan worked. The British assaulted through the woods and smoke, eventually reaching the final line where a vicious close-quarters battle erupted. After heavy fighting, Greene ordered a strategic retreat, saving his main force. Cornwallis technically held the field, but at a catastrophic cost. He lost over 500 men, a quarter of his entire fighting force, including many veteran officers. The British Prime Minister Lord North is said to have exclaimed, "Another such victory will ruin the British Army." Crippled and unable to sustain his army in the interior, Cornwallis was forced to abandon the Carolinas entirely. He marched his remaining 1,500 exhausted men to the coast at Wilmington, North Carolina, and then made the fateful decision to march north into Virginia, hoping to join other British forces and renew the campaign there. This movement left the Carolinas firmly in American hands, setting the stage for the final act of the war.
Part 48. Greene's Grand Strategy and the Battle of Cowpens, 1780 to 1781. Following the fiasco at Camden, George Washington took the unusual step of personally selecting a replacement for Gates, choosing General Nathaniel Greene, his most trusted subordinate and former quartermaster general. Greene arrived to take command of the pitiful remnants of the Southern Continental Army in December 1780, famously observing that his troops were literally naked and were living chiefly on water and rice. Greene, a self-taught Quaker general, knew he could not defeat Lord Cornwallis's professional army in a pitched battle. Instead, he adopted a brilliant and unorthodox strategy of attrition and maneuver. He deliberately divided his small force. He sent a flying column under General Daniel Morgan, the hero of Saratoga, west to draw Cornwallis into the backcountry, while Greene maintained the larger main force to the east. The goal was to force the British to fight across vast, difficult terrain and slowly bleed their supplies and manpower. Cornwallis took the bait, dispatching his aggressive British Legion under Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, a commander known for his ruthlessness, to eliminate Morgan's column. Morgan led Tarleton into a pre-selected field known as the Cowpens in western South Carolina. The Battle of Cowpens, January 17, 1781, is considered one of the most brilliant tactical victories of the war.
Morgan deployed his small force in 3 distinct lines, instructing his front line of militia to fire 2 volleys and then retreat, drawing the confident British into the second line of Continentals. When the militia appeared to flee, Tarleton ordered a full bayonet charge. As the British advanced, they were caught in a deadly crossfire, surprised by the fleeing militia reforming on the flanks and crushed by a final charge from Morgan's Continental Reserves and cavalry, led by William Washington. Tarleton's legion was virtually annihilated, suffering nearly 900 casualties, while the Americans lost only 25 killed. Cowpens was a devastating, irreversible loss for the British Army in the South. It crippled Cornwallis's light infantry and forced him to dedicate his remaining army to the pursuit of Morgan and Greene. Part 49. The Race to the Dan and Guildford Courthouse, 1781. The Battle of Cowpens convinced Lord Cornwallis that he had to destroy the American army in the South at all costs. In a desperate move, he ordered the destruction of most of his army's baggage, wagons, and supplies to convert his force into a light infantry column capable of faster pursuit. This decision committed him entirely to the chase, making retreat impossible. General Greene and General Morgan, having reunited their forces, now began the famous Race to the Dan River. This was not a panicked flight, but a calculated 200-mile strategic retreat designed to lure Cornwallis deep into hostile North Carolina territory, far from his coastal supply lines. The Americans raced north toward the Dan River, the boundary between North Carolina and Virginia. American supply officers, working weeks in advance, had gathered all the available boats and supplies near the river crossing points. Just as Cornwallis, whose exhausted troops were literally marching barefoot through the freezing mud, reached the riverbank expecting to corner and destroy Greene's army, he found that the last of the American boats had crossed hours earlier. With the river swollen and unfordable, Greene was safe in Virginia, having executed a perfect, complex maneuver. After 2 weeks of rest and resupply in Virginia, Greene felt his force was sufficient to turn and fight. He crossed back into North Carolina, taking a strong defensive position near Guildford Courthouse. On March 15, 1781, the Battle of Guildford Courthouse began. Greene, once again using Morgan's brilliant tactical design, positioned his troops in 3 lines of diminishing quality. The first 2 lines of militia would harass the British and fire only a few volleys before retreating, intended to disorganize and exhaust the advancing enemy before they reached the Continental regulars of the 3rd line. The plan worked. The British assaulted through the woods and smoke, eventually reaching the final line where a vicious close-quarters battle erupted. After heavy fighting, Greene ordered a strategic retreat, saving his main force. Cornwallis technically held the field, but at a catastrophic cost. He lost over 500 men, a quarter of his entire fighting force, including many veteran officers. The British Prime Minister Lord North is said to have exclaimed, "Another such victory will ruin the British Army." Crippled and unable to sustain his army in the interior, Cornwallis was forced to abandon the Carolinas entirely. He marched his remaining 1,500 exhausted men to the coast at Wilmington, North Carolina, and then made the fateful decision to march north into Virginia, hoping to join other British forces and renew the campaign there. This movement left the Carolinas firmly in American hands, setting the stage for the final act of the war.
Part 50. The Trap. Convergence at Yorktown, 1781. Lord Cornwallis's decision to march north to Virginia in April 1781 proved to be the pivotal strategic blunder of the war. He believed Virginia would be easier to subdue and offer a better base for future operations, especially since the state's governor, Thomas Jefferson, and the legislature were struggling to raise troops. Cornwallis's force raided Virginia's interior, attempting to crush supply depots and local resistance, but he was successfully shadowed and harassed by a smaller American force commanded by the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette, a young, brilliant French volunteer general, skillfully avoided a pitched battle while keeping Cornwallis occupied. Meanwhile, General George Washington, still observing General Clinton's main army in New York, received information that changed the entire direction of the war. Comte de Grasse, the commander of the massive French West Indies fleet, was sailing north toward the Chesapeake Bay with 28 ships of the line and 3,000 French soldiers. This was the opportunity Washington had waited 6 years for. A chance to combine Franco-American forces on land with French naval supremacy at sea to trap a major British army. Washington executed one of the most brilliant deceptions in military history. He and the commander of the French army in North America, the Comte de Rochambeau, began preparations that suggested a massive, imminent attack on New York City. They built large bakeries, organized encampments, and issued false orders, all meant to be intercepted by British spies. General Clinton, completely fooled, remained hunkered down in New York. In mid-August 1781, Washington and Rochambeau abruptly broke camp and began a rapid, secret march south toward Virginia. It was a massive movement of approximately 4,000 French and 3,000 American troops, marching 400 miles in 2 months, a maneuver known as the Washington-Rochambeau March. Samuel Alden was among the troops marching south, feeling the rush of adrenaline as the realization dawned that they were heading not for a new encampment, but for the final confrontation. Cornwallis, following orders from Clinton to establish a protected deep-water port, concentrated his army of 7,500 men on the small peninsula of Yorktown, Virginia. He was confident in the supremacy of the British Royal Navy, expecting them to deliver supplies and evacuate him if necessary. He had no idea of the trap closing around him. The convergence was complete. Lafayette's army was positioned to block any retreat by land, and the French fleet was about to arrive to close the door on the sea. Part 51. The Naval Blockade and the Siege begins, September 1781. Just as Washington and Rochambeau were marching south, the fate of Cornwallis was sealed not on land, but at sea. The massive French fleet, led by Comte de Grasse, arrived at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, achieving the crucial temporary naval superiority that Washington had dreamed of. The British Navy, based in New York and commanded by Admiral Thomas Graves, attempted to intervene. The resulting naval engagement, the Battle of the Chesapeake, or Battle of the Capes, took place on September 5, 1781. It was a clash of 37 ships of the line fighting for control of the bay. Though the battle was tactically indecisive, de Grasse's French fleet inflicted enough damage to the British vessels and strategically blocked the Chesapeake entrance long enough that Admiral Graves was forced to withdraw his crippled ships back to New York. This French naval victory was the most important single event of the entire campaign. It prevented the British Royal Navy from resupplying Cornwallis's troops, and, most critically, it blocked any possibility of evacuation by sea. Cornwallis was now utterly trapped, locked into his position at Yorktown, cut off from all aid, with only the open ocean behind him, now guarded by enemy ships. When Washington and Rochambeau arrived with their 7,000 Allied troops, they combined with Lafayette's forces, surrounding the peninsula with an overwhelming army of approximately 17,000 French and American soldiers. The siege of Yorktown began immediately. Engineers directed the massive undertaking of digging siege trenches, or parallels, in the European style, zigzagging them ever closer to the British outer defenses. Samuel Alden, wielding a shovel alongside his French allies, watched as the powerful artillery pieces were hauled into place, ready to begin the final assault.
Part 52. The Final Redoubts and Surrender, October 1781. The artillery bombardment began on October 9th. The combined Franco-American cannons and mortars, firing from their newly constructed parallels, unleashed a continuous, devastating firestorm upon the small British fortifications at Yorktown. The constant barrage quickly destroyed several ships in the harbor and reduced the earthen defenses to rubble. The key to ending the siege quickly lay in capturing two forward British strongpoints, redoubts 9 and 10, which protected the British right flank. On the night of October 14th, two simultaneous assaults were launched in the dark. The French forces attacked Redoubt 9, while the American light infantry, led by Colonel Alexander Hamilton, a former aide-de-camp to Washington whose ambition burned brighter than any lamp, attacked Redoubt 10. Following Washington's strict orders, the American troops charged with unloaded muskets and fixed bayonets to ensure silence and prevent accidental friendly fire. Samuel Alden was among the men scrambling up the defenses. The shock of the bayonet charge was complete. Redoubt 10 was taken in under 10 minutes. With the redoubts captured, the Allied artillery was moved forward again, raining direct fire down on the main British positions at terrifying range. Lord Cornwallis's situation was hopeless. His remaining forces were starving, his defenses were shattered, and his expected naval rescue was not coming. On October 17, 1781, 4 years to the day after the surrender at Saratoga, a lone drummer boy appeared on the British parapet, followed by a British officer waving a white handkerchief. Cornwallis was asking for terms. The formal surrender ceremony took place on October 19, 1781. In a final desperate act of pride, Lord Cornwallis feigned illness and delegated the command to his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara. O'Hara attempted to surrender his sword to the French General Rochambeau, a snub to the American commander. Rochambeau pointed him to Washington, who, maintaining his dignity, simply instructed his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, the man humiliated by the surrender of Charleston, to accept the sword. As the British soldiers marched out to lay down their arms between the two long lines of American and French troops, they played the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." The fighting would drag on in some areas for 2 more years, but when the news reached the British Prime Minister, Lord North, he reportedly cried out, "Oh God, it is all over." The siege of Yorktown was the final, decisive military engagement. The independent republic was now a reality.